The wasteland keeps secrets the way a vault keeps survivors buried deep, sealed behind heavy doors, and completely invisible until you know exactly where to look. Fallout is one of those franchises where the thing sitting right in front of you might be the most interesting thing in the entire game, and you walked past it 100 times without ever registering what it was. There are paintings with hidden portraits in them, radio signals still broadcasting into empty air that nobody has ever answered, developer tributes folded inside the textures of enemies, personal photographs from real children placed into ruined schoolrooms, and at least one mystery that the game's own director confirmed had remained unsolved for years after the game's release, and might still be, depending on who you believe. Whole corners of these games exist for the sole purpose of rewarding the kind of player who reads every terminal entry, who wanders into places the main quest never asked them to go, who sits in silence long enough to notice that a particular skeleton has been arranged in a very specific way, with a very specific bottle of wine placed nearby, and that this specific arrangement means something. That's what this is. Not the Easter eggs you already know, not the obvious ones that get covered every time someone makes a basic Fallout list. This goes considerably deeper. These are the things tucked into the margins, sewn into the seams of a world that was designed from the very beginning of the franchise, starting in 1997 with the original game, to make curious people feel like they were being rewarded for paying attention. Developers hiding their own names, developers hiding their children, tributes to directors they admire embedded in props that most players will never examine closely enough to read. References so obscure that only a handful of people on Earth would ever catch them without someone pointing the reference out first. Fallout began in 1997 as a top-down RPG developed by Black Isle Studios, a division of Interplay Entertainment. Its creative DNA was part pulpy post-apocalyptic science fiction, part dark comedy, part genuine meditation on violence and survival and what human beings are willing to do to each other under sufficient pressure. The world it built, the retro-futuristic America that never quite developed beyond the aesthetic of the 1950s before the bombs fell, was rich enough to carry multiple games, multiple studios, and eventually a prestige television adaptation. From the Capitol Wasteland to the Mojave Desert to the Commonwealth of Boston to the hills of Appalachia, this franchise has spent nearly 3 decades building a world detailed enough that you can spend hundreds of hours in it and still find something new. And the developers knew this. They counted on it. They hid things specifically because the world was big enough to hide things in, because players would go looking, because the community that formed around these games was exactly the kind of community that compared notes and dug through game files and traced signals to their sources and pulled skeletons apart looking for meaning. Bethesda Game Studios and Obsidian Entertainment, the two main studios behind the modern entries, have both demonstrated an unusual willingness to build things that most of their audience will never see. Things built with the same care as the most prominent content in the game, placed where almost no one will go. So get comfortable, let the wasteland settle around you. The ambient hum of a distant radio station, the wind across an irradiated desert, the creak of a ruined building slowly surrendering to time. We're going to walk through this world slowly, the way it deserves to be walked through, the way someone walks when they're not rushing toward a quest marker, when they're just moving through the world and paying attention to what the world is trying to tell them. Along the way, you're going to discover that some of the greatest secrets in gaming history have been sitting in these games all along, patient, quiet, waiting for someone exactly like you to finally stop and find them. After this first section, drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing who's out there. And if this kind of deep, unhurried content is your thing, subscribing genuinely helps make more of it possible. Section 1. The Wild Wasteland. Files how New Vegas built a secret layer inside itself. Fallout. New Vegas released in October 2010, developed by Obsidian Entertainment over an intense 18-month development period that was, by several accounts, grueling. The studio had a tight timeline, a borrowed engine, a map that reused assets from an existing Bethesda game, and a team that was simultaneously trying to do justice to the Fallout legacy while also stamping the project with their own identity. By every standard industry measure, the circumstances should have produced a cautious, safe product, something that hit the expected marks and didn't push too hard on the constraints of the development window. Instead, it became, for a very significant portion of the series' fan base, the finest Fallout game ever made. And a meaningful part of what makes it so is the sheer density of what Obsidian managed to hide inside it. Hidden isn't quite the right word, though. Hidden implies something passive, something buried by accident or necessity. What Obsidian actually built was an entire parallel layer of the game, a secret mode, effectively that altered encounters, changed dialogue, spawned completely different items in specific locations, and unlocked scenes and moments that had no equivalent in the standard experience of playing New Vegas. They called it Wild Wasteland, and it might be the most elaborate Easter egg delivery system ever constructed inside a single role-playing game. Here's how it worked. When you created your character at the start of the game, sitting in Doc Mitchell's modest home in Good Springs, recovering from being shot in the head by a man named Benny and left for dead in a shallow grave outside of town, you were given the option to select two traits from a list. Traits are optional character modifiers, a trade essentially, something given in exchange for something taken. You could take Kamikaze for faster action points and reduced damage threshold. You could take Good-Natured for better skills in non-combat areas at the cost of combat skills, and you could take Wild Wasteland. The game described Wild Wasteland as enabling the most bizarre and silly elements of post-apocalyptic Americana. That description is accurate as far as it goes, but it doesn't fully convey the scope of what you were signing up for by selecting it. 22 distinct encounters in the base game alone. More added in each of the 4 major DLC expansions: Dead Money, Honest Hearts, Old World Blues, and Lonesome Road, bringing the total count of Wild Wasteland content considerably higher. These were encounters that replaced serious content with absurd references, that swapped normal enemy types for joke versions, that dropped unique items into the world that existed nowhere else and could only be obtained by players who had taken the trait and stumbled onto the right location. The reason Wild Wasteland exists as a trait as something you must deliberately choose at character creation is an interesting piece of development history in its own right. There were members of the Obsidian team who felt, with some justification, that the original Black Isle games had leaned too heavily into self-referential comedy. That the fourth wall breaks, the pop culture name drops, the general willingness to let the game laugh at itself had sometimes undermined the atmosphere that made the best moments of those games hit so hard. There were other team members who loved that aspect of the old games unconditionally, who felt it was part of what made Fallout Fallout rather than just another grim post-apocalyptic RPG. Wild Wasteland was the compromise they landed on. A system that let players self-select into the silliness, that kept the base experience as tonally consistent as the team who wanted consistency needed it to be, while giving the players who wanted the absurdity a full and carefully constructed version of it. Everyone got what they came for, in the same game, with the same map, running in parallel. The very first thing Wild Wasteland does, if you've taken the trait, is potentially send you somewhere specific within the first 15 minutes of the game. Southeast of Good Springs, in a direction that takes you away from the road to Vegas and away from the first quest markers, in a patch of open desert that has nothing else to recommend it, there is a refrigerator. No door on it. Nothing around it to mark the spot as significant. Inside the refrigerator, curled up in a position that reads as both comic and vaguely tragic, a skeleton, and sitting alongside those bones, a distinctive brown hat. The game calls it the Suave Gambler hat. It provides +1 to perception when worn, which is mechanically useful early in the game but not the point. The point is the image. A man who climbed into a lead-lined refrigerator to survive something catastrophic and almost made it. This is Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, specifically the scene in which Indiana Jones survives a nuclear test detonation by hiding in a lead-lined refrigerator, which the film presents as a completely legitimate survival strategy and which audiences received with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Obsidian planted this reference in the desert, southeast of the starting town, in a direction away from any suggested path. You would only find it if you were the kind of person who explored before following instructions, the specific kind of person the Wild Wasteland system was built for. A little further into the game, outside of Cerulean Robotics in the Freeside area, you will be ambushed. Not by raiders, not by fiends, not by any of the standard threat categories the Mojave Wasteland presents. You will be ambushed by a gang of elderly women. They're called Maud's Muggers, and they're aggressive, and they're carrying weapons. And the first time this happens, it is genuinely disorienting because nothing in the game has prepared you for the existence of violent criminal grandmothers. If you handle the situation and go through what they're carrying, you'll find that they have surprisingly decent loot for early game enemies, which is a separate kind of unsettling. The reference is to Hell's Grannies, a sketch from Monty Python's Flying Circus in which gangs of elderly women terrorize the streets of London, attacking people and menacing normal life with the casual violence of organized crime. Obsidian put Monty Python's grannies outside a robotics facility in post-nuclear Nevada and left them there for the taking. Monty Python doesn't stop at the grannies. If you travel to Camp Searchlight, already one of the more grim locations in New Vegas, the NCR military position that was destroyed when Legion saboteurs opened containers of radioactive material in the water supply, killing or irradiating the entire garrison, and go down to the basement of the Searchlight East Church, you'll find a box. Inside the box are 3 grenades. Next to the box, a note. The note reads, "Holy hand grenades. Pull pin and count to 3, with a crossed-out 5 sitting next to the 3. This is the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And more specifically, it's the callback to King Arthur's inability to count correctly, the running gag from the same scene in which the instructions specify that the count shall be 3, not 4, and certainly not 2, unless the intent is to then proceed to 3. The grenades are real. They function as grenades in the game. Obsidian put functional holy hand grenades in the basement of a church in an already tragic location, pairing genuine environmental horror with complete comedy, and the tonal collision is somehow perfect rather than jarring. This is what the original Fallout games did at their best, and Obsidian understood that deeply. The aliens reference in New Vegas is quieter and requires more active engagement to find. During the Battle of Hoover Dam, one of the major combat sequences near the conclusion of the game's main quest, an operation that plays out differently depending on which faction you've aligned with, there is an NCR emergency radio frequency that broadcasts during the fighting. If you have Wild Wasteland active and you tune into that frequency at the right moment, you will hear a soldier on the other end of the line screaming a line that will be immediately recognizable to anyone who has seen James Cameron's Aliens. "They're coming out of the walls, man. They're coming out of the damn walls." The line belongs to Private Hudson, one of the Colonial Marines, delivered during the sequence when the Marines are overwhelmed in the atmospheric processor, and the situation shifts definitively from manageable military operation to genuine disaster. The line became one of the most quoted pieces of dialogue from the film. Obsidian embedded it into a genuine military emergency broadcast during an actual battle with real stakes, and the chaos of that battle just continues around this one soldier's choice of reference material. The Star Wars encounter in Wild Wasteland is perhaps the subtlest one in the entire system, because it requires the player to be in a place that the game deliberately discourages them from going. In the town of Nipton, which the Legion has sacked and left as a warning bodies on crosses, survivors staggering around with lottery winnings from a twisted prize draw, the Legion's brutality made visible as a message. There is a contingent of Legion soldiers under the command of a man named Vulpes Inculta. If the player has the Wild Wasteland trait active, the specific soldiers standing guard near Nipton's entrance appear not as standard legionaries, but in a specific formation. They're standing in a line, posed in a way that echoes the binary sunset scene from Star Wars, A New Hope. The image of Luke Skywalker standing on Tatooine, looking at the twin suns going down, the composition communicating longing and possibility in a way that became one of cinema's iconic images. 3 Legion soldiers standing in the Nevada dust, replaying a galaxy far away. Then there's the Zyborn clock encounter. This one is so thoroughly obscure that even many dedicated New Vegas players who know Wild Wasteland inside out have no idea what it's referencing. In the town of Novak, the small settlement built around a repurposed dinosaur statue, where a sniper named Craig Boone is available as a companion, and where the narrative starts to pick up pace, there is a character named Johnny. With Wild Wasteland active, he has a specific subtitle and encounter that ties him to a failed game concept called the Zyborn Clock, pitched on the Something Awful internet forums in 2003. Johnny Five Aces was supposedly going to be a character in that game, which never got made, and which by 2010 was an almost completely forgotten curiosity of early internet gaming culture. Josh Sawyer, Fallout. New Vegas's lead designer put this reference in the game knowing that the number of players who would recognize it in 2010 was probably in the low dozens. He put it in anyway. There's a very specific kind of joy in hiding something not for mass recognition, but as a private high five to the exact tiny group of people who would know exactly what they were looking at. Wild Wasteland is full of these moments. The Wild Wasteland system runs through all 4 major DLC expansions, each adding its own layer of content. In Dead Money, the DLC set in the Sierra Madre, a pre-war resort city sealed under a toxic cloud, which forces the player to work with 3 morally complicated strangers to crack a casino that nobody has ever successfully robbed. Dean Domino, the ghoul showman who is one of those strangers, will at one point say, "He's not dead, it's a trick, get an axe." This is a direct quote from Army of Darkness, the 1992 Sam Raimi film. Dean says it with the same matter-of-fact delivery he brings to everything else, as though quoting a 50-year-old horror comedy in the middle of a high-stakes heist is a completely normal thing to do, which in the world of Wild Wasteland it absolutely is. In Old World Blues, the DLC set in the ruins of Big MT, the enormous pre-war research complex where the scientists transferred their own brains into floating tanks and proceeded to experiment on everything they could find, including themselves near a construction site in the facility grounds with Wild Wasteland active, you will find 7 garden gnomes. They are arranged in a semicircle around a cluster of red stones, facing inward, with pickaxes scattered on the ground around them. Snow White and the 7 dwarfs, obviously. The small figures with mining implements gathered around a place that has something to do with their work and their story. The way this is staged, these cheerful little figurines in the ruins of a research facility where mad scientists have been running uncontrolled experiments for 200 years, where the player has just had their brain removed and their eyeballs given independent mobility, makes it feel genuinely strange rather than simply cute. The tonal contrast is working. Lonesome Road, the 4th and final DLC, carries the system to its most emotionally resonant moment. In the Cave of Abaddon, near its entrance, there is a fossilized dog, frozen in time, standing on an overturned file cabinet, facing the cave as though waiting for someone. The dog is named Seymour. With Wild Wasteland active, the name and the encounter are made explicit. The reference is to the Futurama episode Jurassic Park, which is widely considered one of the most emotionally devastating episodes of animated television. The episode in which Fry discovers evidence of his dog, Seymour, who lived on Earth for years after Fry's disappearance into the future, and who stood outside the pizzeria where they used to work every single day, waiting for his owner to come back, until he died. The episode ends on Seymour waiting. Just waiting. Obsidian put this reference at the entrance of a cave in a DLC about loss and consequence and the damage that follows from careless action, and it lands differently than any of the other Wild Wasteland moments because it doesn't make you laugh, it makes you stop. And in Lonesome Road, there is one more Wild Wasteland moment that fundamentally recontextualizes the entire add-on. Lonesome Road ends with the option to launch nuclear missiles at the NCR or Caesar's Legion, or both. This is a serious choice, with serious consequences. It changes the conditions of the Mojave after the add-on's conclusion, alters the final battle, affects the political landscape of the ending slides. If you launch at both factions with Wild Wasteland active, the ending slide that would normally narrate this act of apocalyptic decision-making gets replaced. The image that appears is the Unification Monument, a statue commemorating the joining of the NCR Rangers and the Nevada Desert Rangers, a hopeful image, something built to remember unity, placed in the middle of an ending defined by fire. Ulysses' narration still plays, with all its characteristic weight and melancholy. The slide doesn't become a joke. It becomes something else, a meditation on what you chose, framed by an image of what might have been. Obsidian added a Wild Wasteland variant to an ending slide. That's how deeply the system runs, how seriously they took it. One last Wild Wasteland detail before moving on, because it's too good to skip. In Higgs Village, inside the compound that serves as part of the Old World Blues DLC's environment, there is a doghouse. A small, domestic doghouse. Crouched inside it is a tiny deathclaw named Stripe. Named after the leader of the creatures in the first Gremlins film, the aggressive, cunning gremlin who becomes the principal antagonist and who, despite looking grotesque, occupies the position of domesticated pet within the movie's internal logic. Stripe the tiny Deathclaw will chase you out of the yard if you aggravate him. He won't pursue beyond the property boundary. He will retreat to his house. He has nearly as many hit points as a full-sized legendary Deathclaw. He is physically small and looks vaguely adorable until the moment he is trying to kill you. The Wild Wasteland system in miniature. Section 2. Deacon was watching you before you ever met him. There is a moment in Fallout 4 when you meet Deacon for the first time. He's inside the railroad's headquarters, tucked away behind a rotating bookshelf in an abandoned church called the Old North Church in downtown Boston, the kind of location that requires following a trail of clues the game calls the Freedom Trail. Deacon introduces himself as a railroad agent, undercover operative, master of disguise, someone who has, he implies, been keeping track of you since you emerged from Vault 111. The game delivers this as a narrative beat, a piece of character establishment. He confirms that yes, he knows who you are, that he's been watching. Most players accept this at face value, process it as storytelling shorthand for, this character has been paying attention, and move forward into the railroad questline. What those players do not know, what the game gives you absolutely no indication of, is that Deacon's claim is literally true. He was watching. He was physically present, multiple times, in multiple locations. And if you knew what you were looking for, you could have found him, spoken to him, and had him deflect your questions before you ever reached the church basement. This was discovered by a content creator named Fluffy Ninja Llama, who went back through the early sections of Fallout 4 after meeting Deacon and began looking for him specifically in places he shouldn't have been. The discovery turned what had seemed like a standard companion introduction into something genuinely impressive, a piece of environmental storytelling invisible to almost every player on their first playthrough, requiring knowledge of its own existence to find, yet completely consistent with the character the game eventually asks you to trust. Deacon was in Sanctuary Hills. When you first crawl out of Vault 111 into the ruins of your old neighborhood, blinking in the cold Massachusetts light, processing the fact that 210 years have passed and your spouse was shot in front of you and your son was taken, Deacon is nearby. Close enough to be present, not close enough to be noticed unless you're specifically looking. He is in disguise, which for Deacon means different clothes, different body language, doing something mundane. If you approach him, he deflects. He has answers prepared. He seems, to any reasonable casual reading of the interaction, like a background NPC doing background things in a location where background NPCs are expected. Later, in the area around Concord, where you're heading anyway to rescue Preston Garvey and his group of Minutemen survivors from a raider siege, where the mission ends with you piloting a suit of power armor retrieved from a hardware store roof and taking down a Deathclaw to clear an escape route. Deacon is there again. Different disguise, different activity, still deflecting if you push for conversation. The specific words he uses to deflect are different in Concord than they were in Sanctuary Hills. Someone wrote context-specific deflection dialogue for an encounter that most players don't know to look for. That detail, the specific, non-generic deflection, is what confirms that this was intentional rather than coincidental NPC placement. In Diamond City, the massive settlement built inside Fenway Park's old stadium structure, one of the most populated and visually busy locations in the Commonwealth, Deacon appears again. Diamond City is exactly the kind of place where a master of disguise would choose to be inconspicuous, and he uses it well. The city is full of merchants, settlers, quest givers, ambient characters with full daily schedules, and enough background noise that scanning every face carefully is not something most players think to do when they're in shopping for supplies or following a main quest thread. He's just there, blending in, waiting. If you find him and push, if something in the NPC triggers your attention, he'll have something ready that fits whoever he's pretending to be in that moment. What makes this Easter egg significant isn't just the technical execution, although building a companion who tracks the player silently through multiple early game locations without triggering any quest markers or journal entries is genuinely impressive work. What makes it significant is that the mechanical Easter egg and the character biography are doing the same thing simultaneously. Deacon is someone who observes before he acts, Who spends time building a picture of a person understanding what they do under pressure, how they move through the world, what kind of choices they make when nobody they know is watching before deciding whether to extend trust? The weeks he spends shadowing you through the Commonwealth aren't surveillance in a sinister sense. They're Deacon doing what Deacon does, being the kind of agent who makes decisions based on information rather than instinct. The Easter egg is a character study. It tells you more about who he is than the dialogue in the church basement does, and it does it without saying anything at all. There's a particular melancholy to finding this out. You think back to those early hours of the game, when the Commonwealth was enormous and hostile and you were orienting yourself, when every encounter felt significant because you hadn't yet built the map of what matters. You were never actually alone in those moments. Someone was watching, processing, deciding. The loneliness of Fallout 4's opening, emerging into a ruined world where almost everyone you knew is gone, wasn't quite as total as it felt. Section 3. Radio signals that nobody ever answered. Fallout 3 established something that the series has continued to develop through every subsequent entry. The idea that radio frequencies are not background decoration, they're doors into stories. Galaxy News Radio with Three Dog broadcasting his personality-forward commentary on the capital wasteland's politics from a fortified studio in the ruins of the National Mall. Enclave Radio with its pre-recorded government propaganda still playing decades after the government that commissioned it has been gone, the authority in the recordings entirely hollow now, but still transmitting with the same confidence it had on the day it was made. Classical radio, wordless and comforting, like someone left a museum playing on automatic after everyone else left. These stations set the emotional weather of the capital wasteland the way actual weather sets the mood of a physical place. But tucked between those stations, hidden in the static that your Pip-Boy antenna has to push past to find the recognizable signals, are frequencies that have nothing to do with any faction or any recognizable voice. Signals that most players never tune into because they're occupied with Three Dogs editorializing or simply walking in silence through the ruins of Washington, D.C. Some of those hidden signals are among the most quietly unsettling moments in the entire franchise, and finding them requires nothing more than patience and the willingness to scroll through your radio menu slowly. North of Megaton, out in the open wilderness where the radiation levels are higher and the landscape is less populated, there is a radio tower. This is Tower LP-8907, and it is broadcasting a signal. Pick it up on your Pip-Boy, and what you will hear is strange. A repeating sequence of numbers, read in a calm, robotic voice, cycling through the same pattern over and over. A numbers station. This is a direct reference to a real-world phenomenon that existed throughout the 20th century. Actual shortwave radio broadcasts that transmitted encrypted sequences of numbers, believed to be one-way communications with covert intelligence agents operating in foreign countries. Governments used them during the Cold War and beyond. Some of them are still broadcasting today. No government has ever officially acknowledged operating them. They just transmit endlessly into the air, and the question of who is listening has never been publicly answered in any official capacity. In Fallout 3, this signal leads you nowhere at all. There is no quest marker attached to it, no NPC who references it, no reward for discovering its source. You can stand at Tower LP-8907 and listen to the pattern repeat for as long as you choose, and the game will simply let you, offering no context, no explanation, no resolution. The source is a tower in a ruined world that ended over 200 years ago. Whatever this transmission was meant to communicate, whatever message it encoded, whatever agent was meant to receive it, they are all long past receiving anything. The broadcast continues regardless. Following the lines of power towers north of the MDPL-13 power station, if you push into the wilderness in a direction the main quests have no particular reason to send you, you'll pick up a different signal. Weak. Mostly static. With something garbled underneath it that you can't quite parse into language. If you follow the signal to its source, you'll find a small ruined house with something embedded in the hillside behind it, a furrow in the earth where something came down at speed, the ground scored and disturbed. This is Recon Craft Theta, a small alien scout ship, one-man capacity, down and dead in the northern wilderness of the capital wasteland. Around the front of the craft there's a body, thrown from the cockpit on impact. The ship itself is dark and damaged. No quest marker, no map indicator. No indicator of any kind that this is anything other than one more piece of environmental wreckage in a world full of wreckage. If you're playing Fallout 3 without the Mothership Zeta DLC installed, Recon Craft Theta is simply a mystery. An unanswered question sitting in the wilderness, the body of a pilot from somewhere else, a signal that you can trace but that goes nowhere further. The story it tells is a fragment with no conclusion. With Mothership Zeta installed, standing close to the cockpit will eventually trigger a tractor beam that pulls you up into orbit, beginning an extended questline aboard an alien vessel. That questline exists behind a discovery that requires going specifically to the right part of the wilderness to follow the right signal. Players who stayed on the roads and followed quest markers might complete the entire base game and never know any of this was there. Point Lookout, the Fallout 3 DLC set in the Maryland Bayou, is already one of the stranger environments the franchise has ever built. It's swampy and overgrown and fog-covered, populated by degenerate tribals who have been cut off from the capital wasteland for long enough that they've developed their own cultural practices, their own territories, their own relationship to the ruins around them. The punga plants grow enormous there, their fruit hallucinogenic, hanging in the mist like glowing lanterns. The ferry that brings you over is the only way in or out. The whole place feels like somewhere that has forgotten there was ever an outside, that has turned inward so thoroughly that the rest of the world has become theoretical. Hidden in Point Lookout's atmosphere are radio signals designed to make you feel like you're hearing something you weren't meant to hear. One of them is a sequence of eerie gurgling and moaning traced back to a ham radio that a cluster of feral ghouls has gathered around. The ghouls don't know what the radio is or what it does. They're just near it, the way feral ghouls tend to accumulate near things they were once associated with when they were human. Another signal is an actual distress call someone, at some point in the years before the DLC's present, reached out on a frequency and asked for help. What the signal reveals, if you follow it to its source, is that the call went entirely unanswered. The broadcast continued. The person sending it is no longer there to keep sending it. The help never came. The game doesn't editorialize on this. The evidence simply exists where you find it, and you draw whatever conclusions you draw. Fallout 4 handles radio differently but carries the same essential quality forward. The glowing sea, the devastated southern region of the Commonwealth where the bomb hit most directly, where radiation saturates everything so thoroughly that almost nothing survives without heavy mutation, where even powerful power armor provides limited protection without regular maintenance, contains radio signals. The glowing sea is a place most players visit exactly once during the main quest and leave as quickly as possible. The signals playing in there are playing for an empty audience most of the time. One of them comes from a source positioned in the glowing sea's environment in a way that is technically inaccessible through normal navigation underground, or in a location that requires exploiting the game's geometry to reach. Whether this was a deliberate mystery or a development artifact that survived into the final game is something Bethesda has never publicly clarified. The signal plays. The source remains. The original Fallout laid all of this groundwork in simpler form. The world of the first game is smaller, the distances shorter, the signals fewer. But the feeling is already there, the sense of a civilization that is still transmitting, still sending messages into an atmosphere that has no one left to receive them correctly. The Vault's own broadcast, the one you're searching for throughout the game, has been going out for 13 years before your Vault dweller ever emerges into the sunlight. Signal and silence. Transmission and void. These have been the heartbeat of this franchise since 1997. Every subsequent game has found more intricate ways to make the silence feel inhabited by something you can't quite reach. Section 4. Developer signatures hidden where nobody looks. There is a painting inside the Dugout Inn in Diamond City. The Dugout Inn is a modest establishment, the kind of place in Fallout 4 where you stop to sell off surplus equipment or pick up a drink between missions, where the bartender Takahashi has a single phrase he'll say to you in Japanese, regardless of what you ask him, where the background noise of a functioning settlement hums along without demanding your attention. The painting on the wall looks, at a glance, like a recreation of the famous portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon in his military coat turned slightly sideways, in the composition that communicates authority and ambition in equal measure. An appropriate painting for a bar in a ruined city, perhaps, if you're the kind of person who doesn't look closely. If you stop and look closely, the face in the painting is not Napoleon. The face belongs to Todd Howard. Todd Howard is the director and executive producer at Bethesda Game Studios, the man who has overseen the studio's output since the late 1990s, who has shepherded Fallout through every major entry since Fallout 3, who became one of gaming's most publicly visible figures during the Skyrim era and has remained there since. His team painted him into a Napoleonic portrait using the style of the original, the coat, the pose. The composition all retained substituted his face for the Emperor's, and hung the result in a bar in post-apocalyptic Boston. No quest points to it. No NPC mentions it. It does not appear in any achievement list. It is simply there, an internal joke requiring close attention to a background painting, waiting for the player who stops to look at something they weren't asked to look at. This is not the only place in the Fallout games where Todd Howard's presence is quietly embedded. In both Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, there is a periodic table of elements poster, the kind of educational wall chart that appears naturally in pre-war environments like school classrooms, science labs, any facility that would have had one. The poster looks exactly like any other educational prop in these games. Most players walk past it, treating it as set dressing. If you bring a scoped weapon to bear on the poster and zoom in far enough to read the text in its lower section, there is a message written in the body of the table itself. Todd Howard is amazing in everything his hands touch. No kidding. In Fallout 76, this poster can be found in the Nukasheen bar, in the basement of Big Al's tattoo parlor in Morgantown. In Fallout 4, it appears in several locations with scientific or educational associations. The message has traveled in both games across every platform update, every new release, every version of the game that has shipped since the respective launch dates. Someone on the development team, an artist or a designer with access to the texture asset and enough time to make the modification embedded this tribute, and it has persisted ever since. Howard has never publicly addressed it in detail. No developer has stepped forward to credit themselves for creating it. It's a secret that the game is keeping on behalf of whoever left it there. Joel Burgess is a developer who worked on Fallout 4 and has since moved to other projects. And years after the game's 2015 release, he revealed, in a Twitter thread that surprised even committed fans, that he had hidden personal references throughout the Commonwealth. He described what he called an Easter egg within an Easter egg, within an Easter egg, 3 layers of reference packed into a single environmental detail. The exterior layer is a bloody skeleton in a specific location in the game, posed in a specific way. The next layer in is the weapon lying alongside it, a unique item called the Gainer. The name The Gainer is a quiet tribute to Burgess's friend Steve Gaynor. Gaynor, very slightly rearranged. Gaynor is the co-founder of Fulbright, a game development studio known for the immersive sim Gone Home and its follow-up Tacoma. The innermost layer is the pose of the skeleton itself. The specific way the skull sits between the body's legs, a position that looks like the result of a specific kind of fall, is a reference to the 1988 cyberpunk detective noir game Snatcher, developed by Hideo Kojima. Burgess said in the same thread that he had additional Snatcher references in Fallout 3 as well, placed during an earlier development stint. This single Easter egg asks for knowledge of a late 80s Japanese adventure game, an inside connection to independent game development, and the kind of attention to the details of a dead body that most players direct toward looting rather than analysis. Burgess built all 3 layers knowing that the overwhelming majority of people who would see that skeleton would see a skeleton. He did it because somewhere out there, someone would get all 3 layers at once, would recognize the weapon name, make the connection to Steve Gaynor, and then see the pose and understand what Hideo Kojima's game is doing in the middle of post-apocalyptic Boston, and for that person, the experience of finding it would be something that most Easter eggs can't provide. He built it for a reader who might not exist, and left it for whoever might eventually arrive. Among the details scattered throughout Fallout 4's environments, the concept sketches and children's drawings pinned to walls in elementary schools and family homes, the kind of pre-war domestic detritus that fills the game's interior spaces, are several pieces attributed to someone named Mark Tier. Tier worked on Fallout 4's development. His wife made the drawings. They depict his children, Simon and Ziggy, in a style that is unmistakably personal, not polished concept art, not something created for a game, but actual drawings made by an actual child in the style that children actually draw. These drawings were placed in the ruins of the Commonwealth's domestic spaces as though they had always been there, as though a family in pre-war Boston had made them and hung them, and then the bombs had fallen and the drawings had survived. Someone on the development team made a decision that the right way to fill these ruined rooms was with something real. Not with fictional drawings created to look like children's art, but with actual children's art from an actual family. The children are named in the game's data files. The artist is credited in the community documentation that has built up around Fallout 4's hidden details over the years. Finding these drawings in the game and understanding what they are produces an effect that most Easter eggs don't aim for something that feels personal rather than clever, a trace of genuine life in a world defined by its absence. In Point Lookout, there's a tribute to a different kind of predecessor. The DLC's loading screens and environmental lore reference a real estate company called Isla Negra Holdings, a company that apparently once operated in the Point Lookout area that had ties to the People's Bank of Point Lookout that tried repeatedly to develop the island's tourism potential. Isla Negra, in Spanish, Black Island, Black Isle. Bethesda Game Studios, the studio that acquired the Fallout franchise from Interplay, built this tribute into the historical lore of a DLC location for Black Isle Studios, the division of Interplay that created Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 before being shuttered in 2003. The tribute doesn't announce itself. It requires a translation to get the reference, and a knowledge of development history to understand why the reference is there. It's respectful in a way that feels earned, not a flashy memorial that demands acknowledgement, but a quiet name written into the world's own history, in a place where the world keeps its records. Section 5. The Vaults that carry the darkest stories. The vaults are the most recognizable image in the Fallout franchise. The circular door with its locking mechanisms, the blue and yellow color scheme, the cheerful propaganda promising safety and community and a future for humanity, the tone of an advertisement selling something that the product's actual specification cannot deliver. The vaults are the franchise's central metaphor, the controlled environment where humanity tried to survive by putting certain people in boxes and doing terrible things to them while everyone else looked away. They're experiments, most of them. Not in good faith, not in the interest of scientific progress for its own sake, but in the interest of data collection for corporate entities that plan to use that data in ways the vault residents never knew they were contributing to. Every vault in the franchise has a story. Most of those stories are told through a combination of environmental layout, terminal entries, holotape recordings, and the occasional survivor. But some of the most important stories a vault carries are buried deeper than a single playthrough can reach, requiring the kind of comprehensive attention to terminal text that most players don't bring, or knowledge of game files that exists outside the game itself. Vault 11 in New Vegas is the best example in the entire franchise. You find it south of Boulder City, sealed and ambient in the way that abandoned places have their own specific quietness. The standard exploration of Vault 11 gives you combat Securitron defenders, the remains of the dwellers, the archaeology of rooms to search through and items to collect, and a general sense that something went wrong here in a particularly concentrated way. But Vault 11 has a specific secret that most players miss entirely, because it requires following a path the game never explicitly marks and reading a specific sequence of terminal entries in a specific order. The experiment at Vault 11 was this. Every year, the Vault residents had to sacrifice one of their own to a Vault-Tec overseer system, or the entire population would be terminated. The mechanics of how the sacrifice was selected were left to the residents themselves, with the result that Vault 11's history is a document of what happens to a closed community when it is forced to murder one of its own members annually, indefinitely, with no hope of the requirement ever ending. The terminal entries describe decades of internal politics, the formation of factions, the use of the sacrifice selection as a mechanism for eliminating political enemies, the moral compromises that accumulated across generations, the way the original horror eventually became normalized into procedure. The residents eventually reached a breaking point. They refused to make the annual sacrifice, decided collectively that they would accept termination rather than continue, and the overseer system played them a recording. They had passed the test. Vault 11 had always been an experiment to see whether human beings would sacrifice their principles indefinitely under sufficient pressure, and the answer, across every previous population that had occupied the vault, had been yes. Vault 11's residents were the first to say no. The recording that tells them this also tells them that almost everyone is dead already, because the choices that led to the refusal required going through everything that came before it, and most of them didn't survive the politics. There is a model of one survivor in the game's files. Someone made it out. What happened to this person afterward, whether they rebuilt anything, whether they told anyone what Vault 11 had been, whether they understood that their refusal had been the point all along, is never addressed in any in-game content. The model exists. The files acknowledge the survivor. The story ends there. Vault 77 is a different kind of hidden story, one whose explanation lives entirely outside the game. In Fallout 3, you can find a jumpsuit with a 77 designation inside a container at Paradise Falls, the slaver's compound. There is no Vault 77 on any map, no location to explore, no quest associated with the number. Just this single item with a vault designation that has no corresponding vault in the game world? The explanation is a penny arcade webcomic, a crossover that Bethesda arranged with Gabe and Tycho, the comic's creators. In that story, Vault 77 was stocked with exactly one man and a crate of hand puppets. The single occupant and his relationship with those puppets is the comedy premise of the comic. The jumpsuit in the capital wasteland is the only trace that Vault ever left on the game world proper. If you don't know the comic, the item is simply a mystery with no in-game resolution. If you do know it, the jumpsuit becomes a portal between the game and a piece of external creative work, a piece of Vault 77 that escaped into the world. In the main game of Fallout 4, inside the walls of the castle, the old Minutemen headquarters that the player can restore during the quest Old Guns, there is a large hole in one of the fortification walls. Chained inside this hole is a skeleton. On a nearby desk, a box of Amontillado wine. Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Cask of Amontillado in 1846, a story in which a man named Montresor lures his enemy Fortunato into the cellars of his palazzo with the promise of tasting a rare vintage of Amontillado sherry, shackles him to a wall in a recess, and seals him in with fresh masonry. The revenge is perfect, calculated, and cold. The skeleton in the wall of a Minutemen fortress in post-apocalyptic Boston is not explained by any quest in the game. Nobody who gives you the Old Guns mission mentions it. Nobody in the area acknowledges it. The environmental reference sits there complete, waiting for the player who has read the right story and who stops moving long enough to look at the right wall. Vault 21 in New Vegas is one of the most accessible vaults in the franchise. It's been converted into a hotel and casino on the Strip. Its lobby renovated, and its gaming floor functioning. Its original vault population integrated into Las Vegas society after Mr. House arranged a buyout of their deed by beating their last overseer at cards. The lower sections of the vault are intact, and Sarah Weintraub, the woman who manages it, has a private room in those lower levels. On a table beside her bed is a photograph. Players who look at it and who have also played Fallout 3 will recognize it. It's the image of James and Catherine, the Lone Wanderer's parents, the photograph that James kept with him throughout Fallout 3 as the only physical remnant of his life before the vault. The same photograph asset placed in Vault 21, as though it had traveled west from the capital wasteland. The straightforward explanation is asset reuse. A photograph of a couple is a useful prop, and the developers of New Vegas worked with assets from Fallout 3 throughout the project. But the community has spent years with this detail, building theories about shared universe continuity, about whether the same photograph in two cities and two games is a continuity detail, or a mistake, or an invitation to construct a story about how it got there. The answer probably is asset reuse. The more interesting thing is that the community refuses to let it be only that. Far Harbor's Truman Show reference uses architectural space as the medium. In Vault 118, accessible during the Far Harbor DLC's main quest, there's an indoor recreation area, the kind of artificial living environment the vaults used to simulate comfortable pre-war life for populations who had to spend years underground. Inside this space is an artificial beach. Behind the beach, an artificial horizon, a painted sky, a suggestion of open space in a place that is completely sealed. A small sailboat sits in the scene. The arrangement mirrors the climax of Peter Weir's 1998 film, in which Truman Burbank, who has lived his entire life inside an enormous television set without knowing it, sails toward the edge of his world until his boat strikes the painted dome that contains everything he has ever known. In the film, the horizon breaks open. In Vault 118, the horizon just sits there, immovable, the lie intact. Bethesda built this specific reference into an underground space whose residents were also living inside a controlled environment, also subject to an artificial sky, also unable to get past the wall if they had ever tried. The reference is doing work beyond the simple recognition layer. Section 6. The Unsolved and the Unfound. Todd Howard, at the DICE Summit in 2016, mentioned in the course of a conversation about Fallout 4 that there was still a secret in the game that hadn't been found yet. He said this matter-of-factly, the way you mention something you're confident about, and then the interview moved on to other topics. The fan community did not move on. Fallout 4 had been out for several months at that point, and already its map had been comprehensively documented: fast travel points, settlement locations, weapon spawn positions, named NPC schedules, companion dialogue trees, faction reputation thresholds. The kind of methodical community effort that large open-world games generate, fueled by the combination of personal investment and shared enthusiasm that Fallout reliably produces in the people who play it. Players had been through most of the game's content at least once, and in many cases, many more times than that. And Howard was saying there was still something in there that nobody had found. A member of the Fallout community named Levonicus took this as a direct challenge and undertook what might be the most methodical personal documentation project in Fallout 4's history. Traveling through the map piece by piece, systematically locating and reading every computer terminal in the game. The Commonwealth has hundreds of them: offices, vaults, military installations, research facilities, domestic homes, underground complexes. Levonicus found them all, cataloged them, cross-referenced their contents. He found a great deal of interesting material terminal entries that most players never discover because most players don't read every terminal they encounter, lore details and character histories, and development documentation that fills in corners of the Commonwealth's world. Whether he found what Howard was specifically referring to remains genuinely uncertain. A Bethesda employee eventually confirmed, without significant detail, that the secret had been found. What the secret was not publicly confirmed. What the person who found it discovered was not announced. The community's strongest theories center on a terminal in the Institute that, after a specific patch was applied post-launch, contained information suggesting the sole survivor might themselves be a synth, a manufactured artificial person indistinguishable from a biological human. The Institute creates synths. The game spends considerable time exploring what it means to be a synth and whether synths have rights. The terminal entry, if read as intentional rather than as a documentation error, would recontextualize the entire game. Whether this was the secret Howard meant has never been formally confirmed. Whether anyone has actually discovered whatever was there to find remains, depending on who you ask, an open question. Old World Blues contains a location that has never been fully explained. The X-66 Hexcrete Archipelago is a section of the Big MT Research Complex consisting of two scattered rows of hexagonal concrete structures of varying sizes, arranged in a pattern that suggests organization without making the purpose of that organization clear. The Big MT scientists were apparently experimenting with a construction material called hexcrete. No terminal in the complex fully explains what the experiment was attempting to achieve. No character comments on it meaningfully. The think tank scientists who have specific dialogue about dozens of their other experiments, about their own transformations, about the facility's history have almost nothing to say about hexcrete specifically. The location exists as one of the most thoroughly unexplained things in a DLC, specifically designed to be full of strange things, a space that rewards investigation with more mystery rather than with answers. In the same DLC, the lobotomite experiments, the process by which humans captured by the Big MT research team had their brains replaced with functional substitutes that retained their motor functions but reduced their intellectual capacity, are documented in detail throughout the facility. What isn't documented is the full history of everyone who went through the process before the events of the DLC. There are mentions of subjects, there are names attached to specific experimental variations. Some of those names connect to larger Fallout lore in ways that suggest depths of history not fully articulated in anything the player can access. The Big MT is presented as a place where things happened that nobody fully cataloged, where the scale of the experimentation outpaced the ability of the experimenter to keep track of all of it. The Lovecraftian underpinning of several Fallout 4 locations is a case of Easter eggs hiding in plain sight specifically because the references are too subtle for players who don't bring specific literary knowledge to the game. Old Gullet Sinkhole sits near Dunwich Borers, a quarry location whose name is directly taken from H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror, and the sinkhole's cave system beneath it is designed to evoke Lovecraft's particular brand of cosmic horror. The sense that something old and wrong is present in a place, that the wrongness has been there far longer than any human memory, that looking at it directly would be worse than not looking at it at all. The designers built a sub-mythology into the Commonwealth without any character in the game ever acknowledging it directly. The lore is there for people who know what they're reading. For everyone else, it's just an unpleasant cave under a sinkhole near Greentop Nursery. Section 7. The skeletons that were placed with purpose. In a world 200 years past nuclear war, skeletal remains are part of the visual language of the environment. You're walking through the ruins of the world that existed before, and the people who were in those ruins when the bombs fell are still there, or rather, what remains of them is. Skeletons in desk chairs, at dining tables, slumped against walls, lying in beds where they never woke up, scattered in streets where they couldn't outrun what was coming. After a certain number of hours in a Fallout game, your eye learns to slide past them. They become furniture, wallpaper, the expected visual texture of the post-apocalypse. And that's exactly the perceptual condition the developers exploit, because the most carefully arranged skeletons in these games are positioned with extreme deliberateness to tell a specific story to the specific kind of player who will stop and actually look. Just outside Oberlin Station in Fallout 4, there is a boat wreck, a ruined vessel run aground near the water, the kind of nautical damage you'd expect from something that encountered a catastrophe while underway. Inside the boat itself, one skeleton. In the water near the hull, a second skeleton, with one arm extended upward and fingers reaching toward the surface. Between the two figures, floating where it might have drifted from the vessel, a mutated dolphin. The arrangement of these specific bodies in these specific positions, with this specific sea creature as the third element in the composition, is a deliberate recreation of Quint's death in Steven Spielberg's Jaws. Quint the shark hunter Robert Shaw played in the 1975 film. The obsessive professional consumed by the thing he was hunting is dragged under the water in the film's climax, and the image of him going down is one of cinema's most indelible pieces of staging. The dolphin plays the shark, the boat is the orca. The skeleton in the water has been positioned to mirror the specific geometry of that moment. No quest sends you here, no map marker flags the location as worth investigating. The boat wreck is one of hundreds of nautical hazards along the Commonwealth's coastline. The Easter egg activates only when the player carries the right film knowledge into the space, when they stop at a boat they weren't asked to stop at and recognize the arrangement for what it is. The developers don't explain the joke. They trust that the right people will know. Far Harbor's Titanic reference is in a lake north of the nucleus, the submarine base that serves as the Children of Atom's headquarters in the DLC. In the lake, two skeletons on a door, one on top of the door, which floats, one in the water, clinging to the side of the door. The door is clearly large enough for both of them. This is one of the most publicly debated images in film history, the ending of James Cameron's 1997 Titanic, and the question of whether Jack Dawson needed to die, whether there was room on the door for both characters, whether the choice to let Jack go was a narrative necessity or an avoidable mistake. Bethesda put the argument in a lake in a DLC and left the judgment to whoever found it. The skeleton on top of the door is in the rose position. The skeleton in the water is in the jack position. The specific criticism embedded in the arrangement that there was room, that this didn't have to happen, is built into the placement. At the castle in Fallout 4, inside the walls during the Old Guns mission, the chained skeleton and the box of Amontillado, Poe's story, Montresor and Fortunato, the perfect cold revenge. The specific detail that makes the reference readable, the wine, named in the story's title, sitting on the desk next to the sealed wall, is how the arrangement announces itself to the reader who has encountered the story. Anyone who has studied American literature, or who has made their way to Poe on their own, will stop at this wall and understand what they're seeing. everyone else will move on to the quest objective. Inside the Bad TFL regional office in Fallout 4, northwest of Bunker Hill, a diary entry on the police chief's terminal. The chief is complaining about two officers. They're creating problems. They're not pulling their weight. They're making the chief's professional life considerably more difficult than it needs to be. The officers' names are Willison and Gibbs. Mel Gibson and Danny Glover, the stars of the Lethal Weapon franchise, their names just slightly scrambled enough to be a reference rather than a direct name pull. The diary entry is written as a completely genuine workplace grievance. The specific complaints, the kind of thing that would appear in an actual HR complaint about difficult colleagues, and the names are the only tell. Someone on the development team was thinking about buddy cop films while writing police department terminal entries, and left a trace of that thinking in the game. At the Springvale School in Fallout 3, inside the safe belonging to Reverend Hargrave, a note. The note's contents quote and reference Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction specific lines from specific moments in the film, placed in a Reverend's personal safe. The specific choice of container is not accidental. Pulp Fiction engages seriously with questions of sin and redemption and the possibility of divine intervention, and its most iconic sequences involve a preacher quoting scripture as both threat and genuine belief. A reverend's safe is precisely the right container for these specific lines. This is a reference that only works for people who know both what a reverend is and what Pulp Fiction is, who can hold both of those things in mind simultaneously and see why they're being put together here. Vault 81's history is another story told mostly in the margins. Vault 81 is one of the intact vaults in Fallout 4, still occupied, still functioning as a community, accessible as a settlement the player can do business with and eventually become friendly with. Its experiment involved developing cures for diseases using the population as test subjects, an experiment that was sabotaged by one of its own scientists, who redirected the experimental animals to curing his own daughter rather than following the program. Most of what the Vault's residents know about their own history is incomplete, and some of it is wrong. The fuller story is in the terminal entries, and most players don't read far enough into them to find it. The Vault has been carrying a secret about its own origins for generations, and the secret is sitting in the records room waiting for someone who asks the right questions. Section 8. The Pip-Boy's hidden games and the music that tells a lore story. When Fallout 4 arrived in November 2015, one of the features that generated early excitement was the Companion app, a mobile application that could sync with the game and let you use a phone or tablet as an in-game Pip-Boy, extending the character interface into physical space in a way that felt innovative. The app received coverage and attention. It was used by a decent number of players during the game's launch period, and then mostly set aside as the novelty of the concept settled into the reality of holding two devices simultaneously. What fewer players engaged with, even players who never touched the Companion app, is the fact that Fallout 4 contains 5 fully playable video games accessible directly from the Pip-Boy itself. They're called Red Menace, Atomic Command, Pitfall, Grognak and the Ruby Ruins, and Zeta Invaders. Their real-world source material, in order, is Donkey Kong, Missile Command, Pitfall, Ultima, and Space Invaders. These are not simplified pastiches, they're functional recreations, playable in full on the Pip-Boy screen. You collect holotapes for them scattered throughout the Commonwealth and add them to your playable library. You can sit in the middle of the wasteland between missions and play classic arcade games on your wrist computer. The game gives you a retro gaming console built into the post-apocalypse. Most players are aware of these games at a general level. They show up in inventory, they have names, they can be launched. What fewer players know is that the holotapes for them are in specific locations that make thematic sense. The Zeta Invaders tape, the Space Invaders analog, is located in an area connected to alien content, fitting its source material into the game's larger mythology. Finding all 5 requires deliberate searching, and actually playing each game long enough to register a high score puts the player in very small company indeed, since most people who find the tapes try each game briefly and return to the main quest. Music Disc 5 in Fallout's Minecraft-adjacent experience is worth extended attention, but in Fallout 4, the audio Easter egg worth sitting with the longest is not a music disc, but the audio of the game's radio stations considered as a deliberate curatorial choice. Fallout. New Vegas's Mojave Music Radio plays pre-war standards period music that the series has always used to create atmospheric contrast. The crooners and swing orchestras and pop singers of the 1940s and 50s, whose recorded cheerfulness plays against the visual desolation of the world around them. But the specific songs selected for the New Vegas soundtrack are not random. Several of them have thematic connections to the game's story, to the arcs of specific characters, to the central conflict between the NCR and Caesar's Legion, and House and the Independent Path. Songs about gamblers and card games in a game centered on a city built around gambling. Songs about the American West and who has a right to it in a game about factions fighting over a last viable piece of civilization. The curation is doing interpretive work, not just setting mood. Fallout 3's radio is doing something more direct. Three Dogs broadcasts comment explicitly on the events of the main quest. As they unfold, he knows what you did at Rivet City, he has opinions about Project Purity, he tracks your movement through the capital wasteland, with the kind of investment of someone who genuinely believes in what you're doing. The Enclave radio, by contrast, plays Colonel Autumn's propaganda announcements regardless of what the player does, regardless of whether Autumn's faction is winning or losing, as though whoever put those recordings together expected them to run forever. The contrast between the two stations is a commentary on the difference between responsive community and entrenched power. Three Dog adjusts. The Enclave broadcasts into the void. The mysterious stranger is one of the franchise's most long-running recurring presences. He appears in VATS in the original Fallout, again in Fallout 2 and Fallout Tactics, in Fallout 3, and in Fallout New Vegas. Each appearance is the same. A dramatic figure in a long coat and hat, stepping in at the critical moment to finish an enemy with a well-placed shot, then vanishing before you can get a proper look at him. He has no formal introduction. No NPC explains him. He's just there, sometimes, doing what he does, and then he's gone. New Vegas drops the most interesting piece of information the series has ever provided about who he might be. The Lonesome Drifter, an NPC the player can encounter at a location called El Diablo Canyon, is a guitarist and singer who mentions, in passing, that his father was a mystery. He also carries a specific weapon, the mysterious Magnum. When the mysterious Magnum is drawn, it plays the same guitar sting that plays every time the mysterious stranger makes an appearance. The implication, never stated directly, never confirmed by any game's dialogue, is that the Lonesome Drifter is the mysterious stranger's son. The gun is the inheritance. The musical cue is the connection. Nobody in the game ever says any of this. You have to draw the line yourself and then sit with the fact that you might be wrong. Section 9. The code that remembered the beginning and the names that shouldn't be in the game. When the Fallout television series premiered on Amazon Prime Video in April 2024, it arrived as the most significant expansion of the franchise's audience since any of the games themselves. A prestige production with a serious budget and recognizable cast members, it reached people who had never touched a Fallout game, people for whom the Vault Boy was a vague cultural reference rather than a familiar icon, people encountering the ghouls and the Brotherhood of Steel and the wasteland aesthetic for the first time. The show understood that it was doing two things simultaneously, telling a story for new arrivals and telling a story for people who had already spent hundreds of hours in this world. For the second group, it seeded the season with specific rewards. In the finale of Season 1, a character named Hank McLean, the overseer of Vault 33, Lucy's father, whose loyalties and motivations become the central dramatic question of the season, is confronted by NCR forces and compelled to activate a cold fusion device by entering a code. The code he enters is 101097 10-10-97. The 10th of October, 1997. The release date of Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game. The original game developed by Black Isle Studios, the game that created the franchise, the game that most of the show's new audience had never played. Someone on the production team decided that the activation code at the climax of the season finale should be a birthday tribute to where the series began. 6 digits that mean nothing to most of the people watching, and everything to anyone who knows when the franchise started. Earlier in that same season, a Vault 33 council meeting is interrupted by someone announcing that the Vault's water chip has been destroyed. The residents have approximately 2 months of water remaining. The water chip that breaks is the exact MacGuffin of the original 1997 game. Your Vault Dweller's entire journey in that game, the reason you leave the vault, the reason you enter the wasteland, the reason you encounter every location and character and conflict in the game, begins with a broken water chip. 30 years later, the television show brought the water chip back as a background crisis in a scene most of its audience would read as general post-apocalyptic drama. For the right audience, it's the franchise speaking directly to its own history. The show also connects to New Vegas in the finale's closing moments, when business leaders are assembled discussing the impending apocalypse and the corporate interests at stake. Robert Edwin House, representing Robco Industries, the man who would spend the next 200 years running New Vegas from inside a sensory deprivation tank while his Securitron army maintained his arrangements, appears in this meeting. So does a delegate from the Big MT, the research complex at the heart of Old World Blues. People who had only watched the show would have no context for either of these appearances. People who had played New Vegas recognized immediately that they were watching the pre-war origins of two of the game's most significant narrative forces, glimpsed here in the moments before the bombs fell. In Fallout 4, Codsworth, your pre-war mister, handy robot who has maintained Sanctuary Hills alone for 210 years, can say nearly 1,000 names. This was a celebrated feature at the game's announcement. Bethesda had recorded Codsworth saying hundreds of common names, so that if your character shared a name with someone on the list, Codsworth would address you directly. The list is published. Most of the names are common first names, but embedded in that list, placed by developers who clearly enjoyed the exercise, are names that were never in any press release. If you name your character Todd Howard, Codsworth calls you Todd Howard. If you name your character Fallout 4, he says it. Fallout 5 is on the list, which in 2015 was either a statement of confidence about future development plans or a very patient joke. Doom Guy is there. Gordon, likely Gordon Freeman. Shepard, presumably Commander Shepard from Mass Effect. Herobrine, the Minecraft creepypasta figure. Zork, from the 1977 text adventure that is one of the foundations of the entire interactive fiction medium. The Gru, from the same series, the creature that exists in the darkness of Zork and eats the player if they go somewhere without a light source. There are also names on the list that Bethesda almost certainly did not publicize. Codsworth will address you by names that the game's rating would suggest should not be in the game. These names are in the audio files. Someone on the development team spent time recording them, incorporated the recordings into the shipped product, and the recordings have been in every version of Fallout 4 on every platform since November 2015. The cheerful, patient, loyal Mr. Handy, who has waited 200 years for your return, will call you something considerably less formal if you give him the opportunity. The Institute's access code in Fallout 4's main quest is 9003. This is the PIN that John Connor uses in Terminator 2, Judgment Day, to withdraw cash from an ATM machine early in the film. The Institute in Fallout 4 is an organization that creates synthetic humans indistinguishable from biological humans, that has integrated those synthetics into wasteland society, that is pursuing a vision of human development through technological creation that most of the Commonwealth finds either utopian or sinister, depending on where they sit. Terminator 2's central conflict is about a synthetic human who has been sent back in time. The specific code that gets you into the Institute is the code John Connor punches at a bank machine. The connection is not subtle, but the specific PIN is specific enough that most players type 9003 without knowing whose number they're using. Section 10. The rarest encounters things that require being in the right place. Level 20 is the threshold. Stay below it and a specific thing never happens in Fallout 4's Commonwealth. Once you reach it, and you happen to be in the wilderness north of Greentop Nursery and the Old Gullet Sinkhole, you might see something in the sky you weren't expecting. A light moving fast, leaving a trail, descending, a UFO. Not an asset borrowed from a loading screen or a distant background element, an actual object crossing overhead in real time, visible from the ground, heading somewhere. And then it passes over the horizon, and you hear something impact the ground somewhere in the distance. If you find where it landed and the crash site is not marked, you have to search in the direction you heard the impact. You'll find a wrecked alien ship in a clearing. Small, crumpled, the ground disturbed around it where it came down hard, and nearby, a cave. In the cave is an alien, a single, specific entity with its own health pool and behavioral patterns. This is not a random encounter in the way most Fallout encounters work. It's a scripted event that requires a specific level, a specific location, and active attention to the sky at the right moment. The alien drops an alien blaster when you deal with the encounter, one of the most powerful energy weapons in the game. Players who never achieve the right conditions never see any of this. The alien blaster in Fallout 3 is available through a similar mechanism, but even less explicitly flagged. North of the MDPL 1-3 power station, following the same approximate path that leads to Recon Craft Theta, there is a procedural event, not a scripted location with a permanent presence, but a random occurrence in which an explosion appears in the distant sky and an object comes down. If you're in that part of the wasteland when it happens and you move toward the sound, you'll find an alien blaster on the ground. No ship, no alien, no explanation. Something fell from the sky and left a weapon behind, and if you weren't looking at the sky in that particular part of the wasteland at that particular moment, it happened without you. Diamond City's seasonal decorations require patience, calibrated to a calendar system you can't directly observe. The game runs on an internal clock tied to in-game time, and when that clock reaches December 25, Diamond City transforms. Trees appear, lights go up in the market and the residential areas. The settlement looks festive in a way that can feel almost poignant given what surrounds it. A city wrapped in Christmas decorations inside a baseball stadium in the ruins of Boston. This lasts through New Year's Eve in the game's calendar. Halloween produces different decorations for a shorter window. Most players who have spent hundreds of hours in the game have never seen either version, because the seasonal system runs independent of the real-world calendar and requires specific in-game timing to encounter. Bethesda built an ambient seasonal system into their most populated city and made it one of the game's rarest sights simply by calibrating it to time. Carhenge exists in the wilderness northwest of Sanctuary Hills, in an area that new players often move through relatively quickly on their way toward quest objectives. From a distance, it reads as structural debris, things stacked, something destroyed. If you approach it, the arrangement becomes clear. Full-sized vehicles positioned and stacked in the same configuration as Stonehenge, the ancient megalithic monument in Wiltshire, England. Someone in the wasteland, someone with access to enough automotive debris and enough physical capability to move it, replicated one of the world's most recognizable prehistoric structures using the ruined cars of the pre-war era. No NPC acknowledges it. No quest is associated with it. There is a super mutant behemoth in the vicinity who will make the visit considerably more eventful. The structure itself is a monument to the kind of absurdist human drive that Fallout, at its best, consistently honors the impulse to make something that means something, even when the materials available are post-nuclear car husks and the context is total civilizational collapse. The Cat Cabin, southeast of Walden Pond, is invisible from the outside. It looks like the many other small ruined structures scattered throughout the Commonwealth, the modest homes of the pre-war middle class, mostly stripped by now, structurally compromised by time and weather, not worth investigating unless you're specifically looking for something. If you step inside this particular one, you will find cats. Not a cat. Not a few cats. An implausible number of cats, occupying every surface, regarding you with the specific kind of detached evaluation that cats bring to all new situations. The walls are covered with pictures of cats. The floors are full of cats. The spaces between pieces of furniture are occupied by cats. Someone in the game's fiction, in a world defined by resource scarcity and persistent threat, converted a cabin into a cat sanctuary and maintained it to the point where it became this. The cats are not hostile, they're just cats. The cabin is just absolutely full of them. No explanation is forthcoming. The cat cabin exists entirely to delight whoever finds it, and that is a sufficient reason for a thing to exist. The rocket shed is northeast of Relay Tower 0BB 915, in a part of the Commonwealth that has no particular reason to draw most players. Relay towers are optional infrastructure. They extend radio signal range, which is useful but not urgent. The shed itself looks unremarkable from outside. Inside, the back wall opens onto a balcony. On that balcony, an array of rockets and launchers aimed at various points across the Commonwealth. Someone was prepared to inflict significant damage on significant portions of the region. There is no terminal explaining the plan. No holotape explaining the person, no body providing context, no quest associated with the location. Just the rockets and the launchers and a view of the wasteland and the permanently unanswered question of what was supposed to happen here. Bethesda designed this space and left the story entirely untold, which is either a development detail that didn't get completed or a deliberate choice to let the mystery run without resolution. The rockets haven't fired, the view remains the view. Whatever the person who assembled this was planning, they never carried it out, or they carried it out somewhere the player never goes, or they were interrupted by the same catastrophe that interrupted everything else. The Pikmin Gallery in Fallout 4 is one of those locations that rewards the player who follows a stranger's invitation somewhere they were not asked to go by the main quest. Inside, disturbing paintings, mutilated raiders, and a man named Pikmin, an artist who has been killing raiders and incorporating the evidence into his work. The reference is to H.P. Lovecraft's short story Pikmin's Model, in which a painter produces masterworks of supernatural horror that turn out to be based on direct observation rather than imagination. Rescuing Pikmin or simply completing the encounter produces Pikmin's Blade, a unique knife that applies a bleed effect to enemies. But the more interesting thing about the Pikmin Gallery is the paintings themselves, the specific visual content of what Pikmin has made, the level of detail the development team put into artwork that most players would hurry past while dealing with the raider threat. Someone made these paintings carefully, for a character the player can spend maybe 20 minutes with in total. Closing thoughts. The Wasteland rewards patience. What all of these secrets share the Napoleon painting with Todd Howard's face, the Deacon sightings in Sanctuary Hills, the Numbers Station broadcasting into the ruins of the Capitol Wasteland, the holy hand grenades in the church basement, the Titanic skeletons in Far Harbor's Lake, the developer children's drawings in the ruined schoolrooms. The mysterious stranger's possible son and his specific guitar string is that none of them were given to you. None of them were announced. None of them appeared in a patch note or a pre-release feature list. They exist in these games the same way that interesting things tend to exist in the world, quietly, without fanfare, waiting for someone to pay enough attention to find them. The developers who made these things across Black Isle Studios and Bethesda Game Studios and Obsidian Entertainment across a span of nearly 30 years share something in common beyond the franchise they worked on. They believed that making something interesting for its own sake was worth the labor it required. Joel Burgess building 3 distinct layers of reference into a single skeleton that most players would never stop to examine. The Bethesda artist putting a tribute to Todd Howard on a periodic table poster that most players would process as wallpaper. Obsidian designing 22 Wild Wasteland encounters for a trait that a significant number of players would never select, plus additional encounters across 4 DLC expansions. The radio transmission that has been cycling since before any player ever arrived, still transmitting, with nobody left to hear it. There is a version of game development that treats everything as content delivery things to be found because they must be found. Rewards that exist to incentivize engagement, Easter eggs calculated to generate press coverage and social media discussion. These secrets don't feel like that. They feel like something else. Something closer to what you do when you make something because you love the thing you're making. When you put in a detail because the right person will notice it even if nobody else does. When you hide a reference not for recognition but because you wanted to leave a mark. The Wasteland keeps secrets the way a vault keeps survivors buried deep, patient, waiting for conditions that make discovery possible. Some of those vaults have been open for years and we're still finding what's inside. Some of them might still be sealed, their contents waiting for the right person to walk past at the right angle in the right light and notice what was always there. War never changes, but the Wasteland changes every time you look at it differently, and the people who built these games understood that better than almost anyone else in this medium. They built a world worth looking at carefully. They hid enough inside it to make that looking rewarding for decades. There are still things in these games that haven't been fully explained. Environments that resist interpretation. The unsolved terminal. Radio signals with no confirmed source. The Rocky Road DLC encounter that seems to reference something nobody has identified. The Wasteland is large enough and patient enough to keep its secrets as long as it needs to. If you made it all the way here, thank you, genuinely. These videos take a real amount of research and care to put together, and knowing that someone is actually out there listening, letting it wash over them, finding something in it worth their time, is what makes it worth doing. Drop a comment telling me which secret you're going back to find first, or which one surprised you most. Every comment, every share, every subscription genuinely makes it easier to keep making this kind of content for the people who love it. Subscribe if this is your kind of thing. The wasteland will still be here. So will I. Sleep well. End of script. Section 11. The original games and the roots of everything. Before Bethesda. Before the capital wasteland. Before any of the modern Fallout games that most players know, there were the originals. Fallout, released on the 10th of October 1997, and Fallout 2, released in 1998. Both developed by Black Isle Studios, a division of Interplay Entertainment. Both set in a California that had diverged from history decades before the nuclear war, that retained the aesthetic sensibility of the 1950s into an era of advanced robotics and genetic engineering that collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions when the bombs fell in 2077. These games were isometric RPGs, turn-based, text-heavy, with a tone that blended genuine darkness with a particular brand of American comedy that was simultaneously satirical and loving. They established almost everything that makes Fallout Fallout, and they were full of Easter eggs. The title screen of the original Fallout had a secret embedded in it that required specific physical actions to find. Hold down the Shift key and click the Credits button on the title screen. If you do this, the credits play in an unexpected way. The tone and presentation change, breaking from the serious register of the opening into something considerably more self-aware and comedic. The developers of Fallout knew they were making something unusual, and they hid a version of themselves, a looser, less formal version behind a key combination on the first screen a player ever sees. Most players then, and most players now, never hold down Shift at the title screen because there's no indicator that doing so would produce anything different. The Easter egg was designed for the player who tries things that weren't suggested. The same trick appears in Fallout 2, with variations. Black Isle clearly enjoyed this particular category of Easter egg, the kind embedded in the interface itself rather than in the game world. Approaching the title screen as a puzzle rather than as a gateway is not how most players interact with game menus. The people who found these sequences in the late 1990s did so through trial and error, and eventually through word of mouth, at a time when word of mouth meant actually talking to people rather than reading a wiki. Fallout 2 expanded the pop culture references significantly beyond what the first game had managed, and some of them were aimed at an audience with very specific cultural knowledge. The game is set in the Northern California region, covering locations from Arroyo, the tribal village where the player begins, down to the new Reno Casino City and the Vault City corporate enclave and the NCR settlement that would eventually grow into the new California Republic that features so prominently in New Vegas. Scattered throughout this world are references to films, books, games, and historical events that the developers at Black Isle were processing alongside the work of making the game. New Reno in Fallout 2 is a particular locus of these references. The city is controlled by mob families, each with their own territory and rackets and internal politics, and the families have names and associations that map onto real criminal history and fictional crime narratives in ways that reward the player who brings that context. Some of the specific dialogue options available in New Reno depend on player attributes and skills, and some of those options contain quotations or near quotations from films that a player who knows those films will immediately recognize. The game doesn't flag these moments. You might play through New Reno multiple times and never see a specific dialogue option because you built your character differently, and even if you see it, you might not know what it's quoting. The super mutant town of Broken Hills has a chemistry that was quietly, slightly, testing what it could get away with. The town is a multi-species community, humans, ghouls, and super mutants attempting coexistence, and it has a mine at its center that serves as the community's economic foundation. In the mine, certain NPCs have dialogue that, when parsed carefully, references specific pieces of historical and cultural material that sit in the same uncomfortable tonal space as much of Fallout 2's content. Dark humor applied to dark history, the franchise's characteristic mode. Black Isle's writers were doing something specific with their cultural references, not just dropping names for recognition, but using the references to add a layer of meaning to the game world so that the reference and the context it's embedded and comment on each other. The Den in Fallout 2 is where the game most clearly shows its hand about what kind of material it's willing to engage with. The Den is a bleak settlement, a place of addiction, exploitation, and the specific kind of desperation that accumulates in communities with no institutions, no safety nets, and no enforcement of anything that would prevent harm to the vulnerable. It's also the location where some of the game's most pointed commentary on real-world social conditions is embedded, in ways that were uncharacteristic of most RPGs being made in the late 1990s. The references to popular culture in the Den are specifically chosen. They're the references that Fallout 2's writers associated with the content of the location, the films and books that occupied the same thematic territory the game was working in. One of Fallout 2's most beloved secrets is not a pop culture reference at all, but an internal franchise Easter egg. In the primitive tribe section of the game, you can find a young boy who has fallen into a well. His name is Johnny. This is a direct reference to the classic American television series Lassie, in which Timmy was frequently in peril that required the intervention of his collie companion to resolve. The joke is that in Fallout 2's version, the situation is treated with the deadpan matter-of-factness of the post-apocalypse. There is a kid in a well, and you can choose to help him or not, and the game treats this with the same narrative weight as any other task the player might be given. New Vegas later made its own reference to this with a wild wasteland encounter involving a boy named Jimmy at the bottom of a well. The franchise has been making Lassie jokes at itself for over 2 decades. The original Fallout's Vault-13 water chip quest, the MacGuffin that drives the entire game's plot, is itself a kind of Easter egg for players who understand the history of post-apocalyptic fiction. The water chip is a direct descendant of similar MacGuffins in the genre, the items that force characters out of safety and into the dangerous world that provide the initial motivation before the world reveals that the real stakes are considerably larger than the original mission. The developers at Black Isle were working in a tradition, and they knew it, and the specific design of the water chip quest, its time pressure, its escalation, the way it opens outward into something more complex, is a structural Easter egg for readers of the genre who recognize what was being done. Section 12. The sounds nobody was supposed to hear. Sound design in the Fallout games operates on several levels simultaneously. There's the music, which gets the most attention, the pre-war pop standards on the radio stations, the orchestral scores that play during exploration, the ambient sound design of specific environments. There's the voice acting, which in the modern games is extensive and carefully directed. And then there's a third layer that most players never consciously process. The ambient audio that plays in the background of specific locations, building atmosphere without demanding attention, doing quiet work while the player's conscious mind is elsewhere. Some of the most interesting secrets in the Fallout games are embedded in this third layer. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3 is already one of the game's most intentionally unpleasant locations, a place designed to feel wrong from the first moment you enter it, with architecture that doesn't quite make sense, with enemies that seem more disturbed than the average feral ghoul, with environmental details that suggest something happened here before the bombs fell that had nothing to do with nuclear war. The ambient audio in Dunwich building includes sounds that don't have obvious source objects, whispers that seem to come from no particular direction, tones that rise and fall without connecting to any visible environmental feature, rhythmic sounds that suggest something organic in a building that should only contain the dead. Most players who move through Dunwich building are focused on the combat and navigation challenge of the space. The audio plays for them in the background and registers as part of the general creepiness without being specifically examined. Players who have returned to Dunwich building with headphones and focused specifically on the audio report details that suggest the sound designers were doing something deliberate. Specific sounds at specific points in the building's progression. Audio that seems to respond to player position in ways that rule out pure ambient randomness. Whether this is a genuine designed experience or the brain constructing patterns in genuinely random ambient audio is one of those questions that the design of the location leaves deliberately unanswered. The Dunwich building is designed to make you uncertain about what you're experiencing. The audio is part of how it achieves that. Fallout. New Vegas has an ambient audio mystery associated with a location that most players visit for entirely mundane reasons, Boulder City. Boulder City is a small settlement that has been the site of a major battle between the NCR and Caesar's Legion, and the terrain around it still shows the signs of that conflict. The town itself is quiet, a few NCR soldiers, a few civilians, nothing that suggests the area is worth extended investigation. But in certain parts of Boulder City, at certain times, players have reported hearing radio static that doesn't connect to any tunable frequency, playing through the ambient audio in a way that doesn't match any in-game radio station. Whether this is an ambient audio detail, a glitch in the audio management system, or something designed to be heard by the right person in the right place is not something the game or its developers have clarified. The radio telescope at Black Mountain in New Vegas is associated with Tabitha, the super mutant leader who has been broadcasting her own programming across the region. Her radio show is intentionally comedic. She and her friend Rhonda, a Mr. Handy robot she has befriended, conduct programming that is part propaganda and part sincere entertainment. But the telescope facility itself, and the audio environment around it, has details that reward attention beyond the main quest content the location provides. The specific sounds that play in the upper sections of the facility, away from the main combat areas, include transmissions that are neither Tabitha's programming nor any other identifiable signal. They're playing from somewhere into the facility's audio environment, and they're not explained. Point Lookout's audio design is the Fallout 3 example most worth dwelling on, specifically because of how it communicates the location's character. The swamp audio in Point Lookout includes sounds that function as environmental storytelling in ways that the visual design alone can't achieve the quality of silence between sounds. The specific timbre of the ambient nature sounds that play in the bayou environment, the way the human sounds of the settlements feel isolated against all of that background nature. There is something in Point Lookout's audio that communicates the specific feeling of a place that has been cut off from the rest of the world for long enough that it has developed its own relationship to silence. The audio designers apparently spent considerable time with recordings of actual swamp environments to build Point Lookout's soundscape. Some of what they incorporated is directly identifiable as real-world ambient recording. Some of it isn't. Fallout 76's audio design includes a category of sound that the game's multiplayer structure makes particularly strange: the ambient audio of empty locations. Fallout 76 is an online game that can technically be played with other people present, but the experience of walking through a location alone, which happens frequently in a game whose server populations are distributed across a large map, is one in which the ambient audio of the location plays without any human presence to contextualize it. The factories and government facilities and Vault-Tec buildings of Appalachia have audio environments designed to carry the weight of decades of abandonment, and those audio environments were presumably created with the expectation that players would encounter them in the context of other players' presences and activities. Experienced alone, some of them feel much stranger. The glassed cavern in Fallout 76 has an ambient audio environment that includes something the game's audio documentation identifies as related to ultracite, the rare mineral deposit that the cavern is rich in. Whether the specific audio qualities of the ultracite section are a designed detail or a processing artifact of how the game renders the material's audio properties is something that the community has spent time on. The cavern also contains the wooden blocks spelling Pluff that reference Colossal Cave Adventure. As documented in the Fallout Wiki, an Easter egg embedded in a physical object in the same space as potentially intentional ambient audio design. The combination of the two makes the glassed cavern one of the denser Easter egg environments in the game. Section 13. The world that responded to what you did. One of the most underappreciated categories of hidden content in the Fallout games is the content that only appears because of specific choices. The player-made content that exists in the game but is only accessible through a particular sequence of actions, some of which are not suggested by any quest or NPC. These are the secrets that function as rewards for a specific way of playing, invisible to anyone who plays differently. Fallout. New Vegas has a mechanic called Reputation, a sliding scale that tracks how each faction views you based on your actions. Most factions in the game can be reached through the main quest, and most players end up with the reputation that naturally accumulates through quest completion. But New Vegas has faction reputations that can shift in ways that open content most players never see, because reaching those reputation states requires doing things the game never directly prompts you to do. The three families of the strip Omertas at the Gomorrah Casino, White Glove Society at the Ultra Lux, Chairman at the Tops Casino each have their own internal politics that can be engaged with at levels well beyond what any main quest requires. The Omertas in particular have a hidden conspiracy running through their organization that most players miss entirely because fully uncovering it requires spending time at Gomorrah doing things the main quest has no reason to send you to do. The conspiracy, when fully explored, connects to one of the potential endings of the main quest in a way that makes that ending significantly more meaningful for the player who discovered it on their own. The White Glove Society at the Ultra Lux have a secret that also requires sustained engagement with a faction that the main quest passes through briefly. The White Gloves are sophisticated, theatrical, deeply invested in the performance of refinement. They also, as a faction, have a history that the game will only fully reveal to players who approach them with enough suspicion to keep pushing when the conversational surface seems complete. What the White Gloves have been doing, and what they intend to keep doing, is one of the game's more unsettling secondary discoveries, not because it's more horrifying than the game's many explicit horrors, but because it's so thoroughly hidden behind polished manners. In Fallout 3, the karma system, which tracks the player's accumulated moral choices and affects how NPCs treat them, has specific effects that most players never trigger, because triggering them requires reaching karma extremes in specific combinations with other game states. Very good karma in the capital wasteland produces specific encounters. A group of children who follow the lone wanderer offering items, recognizing them as a hero. Very bad karma produces a different kind of encounter. These aren't quest triggers, they're world responses to how you've played, reactions the game has built into its systems that require extreme commitment to a specific moral position to see. The Lone Wanderer's age in Fallout 3 is another system-responsive detail that most players don't notice because they move through the opening sequence of the game quickly. The game opens on the day of your birth in Vault 101, then skips through key moments in your childhood and adolescence before releasing you into the capital wasteland as a 19-year-old. The specific dialogue available during those flashback sequences, the conversations you can have with James, with Amada, with Jonas, with other vault dwellers in the early sections varies based on choices the game doesn't flag as having consequences. What people say to you in Vault 101 before the Exodus, and what you can say to them, is building a history that the game proceeds to make complicated use of. Players who rush through the Vault 101 sections miss context that makes the main quest's emotional stakes considerably higher. Fallout 4's companion system has relationship tracks for each companion that unlock unique content as the relationship develops. Most players experience the early stages of these tracks, the conversations that unlock as your time with a companion increases. But relatively few players develop all companion relationships to their maximum, because doing so requires sustained investment in characters beyond what any quest demands. The content at the end of those tracks includes information about the companions that recontextualizes earlier interactions, dialogue that the companion delivers only to a player who has earned the right level of relationship, and in some cases, unique quests that alter how the companion fits into the Commonwealth story. Piper's fully developed companion track changes what you know about her and about Diamond City in ways that the early stages of the relationship don't suggest. Nick Valentine's maximum relationship content is some of the most revealing character writing in the game. Most players see the early stages of these tracks. Very few see the ends. The Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 4 has faction-specific content that only becomes available to players who invest heavily in the Brotherhood questline, and who approach specific characters with enough conversation to trigger their personal histories. Elder Maxon, the young leader of the Brotherhood, whose severe ideology drives the faction's agenda in the Commonwealth, has dialogue accessible through sustained, specific conversation that provides context for how he became what he is. Most players who take the Brotherhood questline to completion do so without ever fully understanding Maxon's internal motivation, because unlocking that understanding requires a kind of deliberate relationship building with a character who is presented as primarily institutional rather than personal. The personal story is there. It's just behind more conversational effort than most players invest. Fallout 76's event system contains content that is only accessible when multiple players are present and cooperating in specific ways, which makes it genuinely rare content in a game where server populations vary dramatically. Some of the game's most elaborate encounters and environmental details were designed with the assumption of multiple players engaging with them, meaning solo players who make up a significant portion of 76's actual play patterns never see them function as designed. The Mothman, which is the most iconic cryptid in Fallout 76's Appalachian mythology, has encounter conditions that are substantially more likely to be met when certain in-game states align, states that are more likely to exist when the server has been populated and events have been running. A player who is alone on a quiet server might play for hundreds of hours in Appalachia and never see the Mothman at all. Section 14. The long view: what these secrets say about how Fallout is made. Standing back from all of these specific discoveries, the paintings, the radio signals, the skeletons, the tribute to Black Isle, the children's drawings, the wild wasteland perk system, the companion who was watching all along, there is something worth noticing about the pattern they form together. These secrets were not made because they were required. None of them appear in any game design document as mandatory content. None of them are attached to achievement unlocks or quest completion metrics or any of the measurement systems that game publishers typically use to evaluate whether something was worth making. They exist because the people who made these games cared about making them well enough that the care extended past what anyone required them to do. This is a specific quality, and it's not as common as it might seem. The games industry produces enormous volumes of content, and much of that content is made to specification. This many square meters of explorable space, this many hours of main quest gameplay, this many weapons and enemies and abilities. The specification gets met. The game ships. The specifications meeting is the point. What's unusual about the Fallout games, particularly the entries that people hold in the highest regard, is that the developers consistently went past the specification in ways that were invisible to the people setting. Those specifications. They hid things in places they weren't asked to put things. They wrote dialogue for encounters that nobody was required to have. They spent time on radio broadcasts that most players would never tune into, on skeletons posed as references to films the art director happened to love, on tribute to studios that had closed years before. The Black Isle tribute in Point Lookout is perhaps the purest expression of this quality. Black Isle was gone by the time Fallout 3 was being made. Bethesda had purchased the franchise from Interplay and was building their own vision of the Fallout world, their own interpretation of what the series could be in the era of three-dimensional open worlds and first-person perspective. The people at Black Isle who made the original games were not involved in Fallout 3. Some of them were at Obsidian, which made New Vegas, and in that case, there's a more obvious connection. These were people making a game in a franchise they had helped create, putting their own history inside the new work. But the Bethesda team, making Fallout 3, had no obligation to Black Isle. They could have simply made their game and let the franchise's history be the franchise's history. They chose instead to write Isla Negra into the environmental lore of a DLC expansion, in Spanish, in a context that required translation and franchise knowledge to decode. They chose to make the tribute invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. This is not how you make a tribute that generates positive press coverage. This is how you make a tribute for the people who would actually understand it, not for the audience, but for the specific members of that audience who would know exactly what they'd found and why it mattered. The same logic applies to the Zyborn clock reference in Wild Wasteland. Josh Sawyer put that reference in knowing it would be recognized by essentially nobody on initial release. The Zyborn clock was not famous. It was not a well-known piece of game development history. It was a forum post from 2003 describing a game concept that never materialized, known only to the specific community of people who had been on something awful during that particular period. Sawyer put it in because he was one of those people, because he remembered, because the character of Johnny Five Aces deserved to exist somewhere even if the game that was supposed to contain him never did. These secrets are letters to very small audiences, written with the same care as the content that reaches everyone. They're the game developers behaving the way writers sometimes describe their best work, making something for one ideal reader rather than for the statistical average of their audience, trusting that the right people will find what was left for them. What this means for the Fallout community specifically is that the games are still giving up new things years and decades after release. The discovery pipeline hasn't closed. Players who return to these games or who encounter them for the first time are still finding things that nobody cataloged, still making connections that hadn't been made, still having the experience of realizing that something they walked past 100 times had meaning the whole time. This is not an accident of game design. It's the result of developers who built more than they needed to build and trusted the world they were building to keep the surplus secret until the right person arrived. The best wasteland isn't the one you've fully mapped. It's the one that still has corners you haven't been to yet, still has signals you haven't tuned into, still has a skeleton that means something waiting in a location you've passed by without stopping. The developers who made these games knew this. They built the secrets accordingly. Section 15. Things that were cut and left traces. The Fallout games are full of content that didn't make it, ideas that were developed, partially implemented, and then removed before the game shipped, leaving behind traces in the game's data files that dedicated community members have since excavated and cataloged. Some of these cut elements are simple. A weapon variant that didn't make it to final balance, a quest that was planned but never written, a character who was designed and voiced but ultimately removed from the flow. Others are considerably more interesting. New Vegas had a companion who was cut late in development, Ulysses. The character who becomes the antagonist of the Lonesome Road DLC was originally designed as a companion available in the main game, a Legion-aligned companion whose backstory and ideology would have given players who chose that. Faction. A personal relationship with someone from inside. It. He was designed, he was voiced, and he was cut because development time ran short. When the DLC came around, Chris Avellone was able to use the character in a context that is arguably more resonant than a standard companion role would have been. Ulysses as an antagonist the player has a specific history with, whose ideology they've had to engage with through the DLC structure rather than through day-to-day companion interaction. The cut made Ulysses more interesting. That's not usually how cuts work. The traces of Ulysses in the main game, the references other characters make to him, the hints in Dead Money and Honest Hearts and Old World Blues that someone was there before the courier, the way his absence from the companion roster is specifically shaped are themselves a kind of hidden content. You can play New Vegas without ever knowing that there was a companion you didn't get to have. You can also play it paying attention to every reference and build a fairly complete picture of who Ulysses is before you ever reach Lonesome Road. The DLC reads differently depending on how much of that prior attention you've paid. Fallout 4 has cut content throughout its files that the modding community has been examining since shortly after release. Some of this cut content represents significant narrative material. Full dialogue trees for companions that go further than what shipped, quest stages that were written and then abandoned, character arcs that were started and not completed. The Institute's internal politics, as designed, were considerably more complex than what appears in the final game. There are faction subdivisions and internal characters who were built to a certain level of development and then simplified during production. Players who engage with the final game have a version of the Institute that functions adequately for the main quest's purposes. The version that was started but not finished suggested a considerably more nuanced portrayal. Point Lookout's cut content includes environmental details that were removed without removing all of their associated data, leaving ghost content in the files, things that reference things that aren't there, audio that points to sources that were taken out, dialogue that references events that no longer occur. These ghosts are a different kind of Easter egg. Not something the developers hid intentionally, but something they left behind unintentionally. Traces of a version of the game that was being made before the version that shipped. The Pit, the Fallout 3 DLC set in the ruins of Pittsburgh, was designed to leave a moral question genuinely open, a conflict where both sides had legitimate grievances and legitimate failures, where the correct choice was not evident from the framing of the quest. The cut content for the Pit includes material that would have made both sides of that conflict even more morally complex than what shipped, characters who were excised because they pulled the narrative too strongly toward one interpretation or another. What shipped is already more morally ambiguous than most game quest design of its era. The version in the file suggests the designers were trying to go further. Fallout 76's cut content is extensive in ways that reflect a development process, interrupted by the need to ship a multiplayer game on a specific schedule. Characters who were written and had voice recording but were removed from accessible areas. Quests that were outlined and partially implemented. Environmental storytelling laid out in a section of the map that was then altered before final release, leaving the storytelling elements still present but divorced from the context that was supposed to make them readable. The modding community for Fallout 76 has been slower to develop than for the previous games because of the game's online-only structure, but community members who have examined the game's files have documented a significant volume of content that exists in the data without existing in the accessible game. Final section: the franchise that keeps talking to the people who listen. Fallout began as a game about exploring the ruins of a civilization and finding what had been left behind. The player's job structurally was always to be the person who went into the wreckage and paid attention, who read the terminal entries, who picked up the holotapes, who talked to everyone long enough to hear what they needed to say. The franchise's core loop, present since 1997, is the loop of attentive exploration, going somewhere, being curious about what's there, and finding that the world has things to tell you if you're willing to listen. The Easter eggs are the franchise being faithful to its own premise. The developers made a world designed for the kind of player who pays attention. Then they filled that world with things that reward paying attention at every level, not just at the level the game requires, but at the levels beyond requirement, into the territory where most people have moved on to other things. They built content for the person who reads the entire terminal, who comes back to a location a second time looking at it differently, who sits still long enough to hear what the ambient audio is actually doing. This relationship between the games and their community has produced something unusual in the history of entertainment. A franchise that keeps generating new discovery decades after any given entry's release. Fallout 3 came out in 2008. Players are still finding things in it. New Vegas shipped in 2010, and the community is still mapping the full scope of what Wild Wasteland contains, still constructing the lore implications of the connections between DLC characters, still debating the mysterious stranger and his possible son. Fallout 4 is approaching its second decade, and Todd Howard's unsolved terminal secret remains exactly the kind of productive ambiguity that keeps people in the game world longer than they might otherwise stay. The radio signals that nobody answered, the number station in the Capital Wasteland ruins, the skeleton posed as a reference to a 1975 shark movie, the children's drawings in the ruined schoolroom, the tribute to Black Isle in the language of the bayou, the Wild Wasteland perk that turns the entire game into a parallel version of itself for players who opt in. These are all saying the same thing in different registers. We made this for the people who look. We believe those people existed. We believe they deserved to find something when they looked. We built accordingly. The Wasteland has always rewarded the people who walk slowly, who read the signs, who follow the signal even when it seems to be leading nowhere, who stop in front of a skeleton and think about what the position of the bones might be saying. This is what Fallout has always been. From 1997 to the present, a world made by people who loved what they were making, who put more of themselves into it than anyone required, who left traces of that love in every corner for anyone patient enough to find them. The Wasteland is waiting. It has been waiting for a long time. It is very good at waiting. Take your time. And if this video helped make the waiting a little more comfortable tonight, subscribe, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there, and which corner of the Wasteland you plan to look at differently now. That's what this is for. Sleep well. End of script. Bonus section: the smaller things that make the world feel alive. There is a category of Easter egg in the Fallout games that is distinct from the film references and developer tributes and Wild Wasteland encounters, smaller, quieter things that exist, not as references to anything outside the game, but as evidence that the people who made the game were paying attention to the internal logic of the world they were building. These are the details that make the world feel real at the level below narrative. The kind of thing you notice because you were already looking carefully and then found something you weren't specifically looking for. In Diamond City, there is a red chair. Just one, amid all the other seating in the stands that ring the old Fenway Park Stadium. It's painted a different color than every chair around it. This exists in real life. Fenway Park has a red seat in Section 42, Row 37, Seat 21, marking the point where Ted Williams hit the longest home run ever measured at Fenway Park, a 502-foot shot on the 9th of June, 1946. The ball was measured from where it came to rest. It hit a fan named Joe Boucher in the straw hat, passed through the hat, and landed several rows back. The red seat marks that landing point today as a kind of permanent geometric tribute to the distance the ball traveled. Bethesda put a red chair in Diamond City's stands. No NPC mentions it, no quest references it, but it's there, marking the same spot it marks in the real stadium, in the game's version of the park, because someone on the development team knew about Ted Williams' home run and thought it deserved to survive the apocalypse. The Cheers bar reference in Fallout 4 is a case study in how these references work at their best. The Prost bar in Beacon Hill is designed to evoke the real-world bar in Boston that inspired the 1980s sitcom, a show set in a bar run by a former Boston Red Sox player, where a regular crowd gathered to talk about life and the things that made it difficult and funny and worth continuing. The fictional bar in the show was deliberately modeled on a real establishment in Beacon Hill. Fallout 4 put its post-apocalyptic version of that bar in the same neighborhood, with baseball memorabilia on the walls, and placed two skeletons at the bar stools in position, suggesting two people who had been there when the bombs fell and stayed until the end. Someone knew enough Boston geography and enough television history to layer these references into a single location. Most players visit the Prost bar as a location to loot, not as a tribute to a sitcom about camaraderie in a Boston bar. The specific books available in Fallout 4, the ones you can find in libraries and homes and schools, are not random. The titles on the shelves in the game's domestic spaces are a curated selection of real and fictional titles that reflect something about the pre-war culture the game is depicting. This is the kind of detail that requires being familiar enough with the titles being referenced to recognize what's there, and that rewards that familiarity with a sense that the pre-war Boston the game is depicting was a place where specific people with specific reading habits lived. The literary references throughout the Fallout 4 Commonwealth, from the Poe at the castle to the Lovecraft at Dunwich Borers, to the titles on the shelves in ordinary homes, form a kind of reading list for the world's civilization in the moment before it ended. Nick Valentine's backstory, accessible through the companion questline, is another case of the game's internal world-building doing something specific that most players miss. Nick is a synth who carries the memories of a real, pre-war detective memories that aren't his, that he experiences as his own history without being quite able to reconcile them with what he knows about his own nature. The quest that explores his backstory goes into the history of pre-war Boston in ways that connect to real locations in the game world, placing the fictional history of a fictional character into a specific real urban geography. Players who complete Nick's companion quest and then go back through the Commonwealth with his history in mind will find that certain locations read differently, that Nick's relationship to the city he's in is visible in the environment in ways it isn't to a player who hasn't done that quest. The bottle cap economy in Fallout, the choice to make pre-war currency useless and bottle caps the standard medium of exchange, is itself an Easter egg for players who know the franchise's history. The use of bottle caps as currency originated in Fallout 1 as an in-world explanation. NCR water merchants, who controlled much of the water supply in the wasteland, used bottle caps from Nuka-Cola bottles as their preferred payment medium because the caps were difficult to counterfeit and tied to a product whose distribution they controlled. When the NCR later started printing their own paper currency, the cap economy persisted in areas outside NCR control because of habit and preference. The economics of this decision are worked out in the game's lore in ways that reward players who dig into the background material, who ask merchants and NPCs about the cap economy and follow those conversations as far as they'll go. The Nuka-Cola brand itself, the most prominent fictional product in the Fallout world, whose ubiquity in the pre-war era has made its bottles a defining image of the franchise, has an internal history embedded in various places throughout the games. Terminal entries in Nuka World, the Fallout 4 DLC set in a Nuka-Cola themed amusement park, document the brand's development, its marketing strategies, the specific Nuka-Cola variants that were developed for regional markets and specialty uses. The park itself is designed as an extended love letter to and critique of American theme park culture, and the specific details of how Nuka-Cola is portrayed within the park, the history embedded in the brand's fictional records, the character of the company behind it are a more complex examination of pre-war American corporate culture than most players who go to Nuka World for the Raider content ever engage with. The Mr. Handy robots throughout the Fallout games are another category of detail that rewards close attention. The specific things different. Mr. Handy say, and the context in which they say them, are calibrated to the specific situations those robots were designed for and have found themselves in after the war. The Mr. Handy maintaining an abandoned restaurant says specific things about service and hospitality and the customers who are no longer coming. The Mr. Handy guarding a pre-war corporate facility says specific things about security protocols designed for a world that no longer exists. These robots were programmed for a world that ended 2 centuries ago, and they're still running the programs, and the comedy and pathos of their continued operation in an inappropriate context is written into their dialogue with more care than most players stop to appreciate. Sanctuary Hills, the neighborhood where the sole survivor lived before the war, is full of pre-war domestic life that most players walk through once to grab early loot and never examine again. The specific contents of the houses in Sanctuary Hills, the items on the shelves, the things in the refrigerators, the books left out on tables, the toys scattered in children's rooms, the personal technology left behind by the families who live there paint a picture of a specific class of pre-war American life that the game uses as a baseline against which everything that has happened since is measured. Players who read the terminal entries in these houses before they leave Sanctuary Hills for the first time get a version of the game's opening that is considerably more grounded and personally specific than players who skip past that. Content. The design of the vaults themselves, their internal architecture, the specific choices made about what kinds of spaces to include and how to arrange them, reflects the fact that someone was thinking about what it would actually take to design a self-contained underground community built to last over a century. The original Black Isle vaults had a certain aesthetic, functional, institutional, the specific visual language of infrastructure pressed into service as housing. As the games have developed, that aesthetic has been refined and complicated, with specific vaults having design languages that reflect the specific kinds of people who were supposed to inhabit them. Vault 21's casino design, Vault 81's medical facility emphasis, Vault 118's recreation of a specific class sensibility. Each one is an argument about what the people who designed it thought mattered most about human civilization. The Diamond City radio station, operated by Travis Lonely Miles, the most anxious disc jockey in the post-apocalyptic American Northeast, has a relationship arc running through it that most players don't follow to its end. Travis starts out painfully nervous, barely able to complete announcements, filling dead air with self-deprecating commentary on his own inadequacy. As the player completes a specific quest chain involving Travis, his confidence grows and his broadcasting style changes to match. By the end of that arc, he's a completely different broadcaster. More assured, more engaged, better at the job. Most players experience the early nervous Travis and never trigger the quest chain that shows them what he becomes. The radio station is playing a character study in real time throughout the game, and most players only see the first chapter of it. The settlements the player builds in Fallout 4 are themselves a kind of Easter egg for players who examine the mechanics carefully. The settlement system rewards specific choices with specific outcomes, with objects that can be created and arrangements that can produce particular effects in ways that the game's tutorials only begin to explain. Players who have spent hundreds of hours in the settlement system have found interactions between objects and NPC behaviors and environmental conditions that the game never officially documented. The settlement system is large enough that it continues to yield new combinations for the players who engage with it most deeply, years after every officially documented mechanic has been cataloged. Finally, there are the loading screens. Fallout 4's loading screens contain Pip-Boy illustrations that accompany tips and lore fragments, and the specific tips chosen for specific moments of play. The things that appear on the loading screen while the game loads content associated with particular regions or quests are calibrated to that content in ways that take effort to notice. Loading screens that appear during emotionally significant moments in the game's narrative have been chosen to say something that relates to what the player is about to experience. This isn't universal or constant, but it's sufficiently consistent that players who pay attention to their loading screens during meaningful narrative moments sometimes report that the screen seemed to know what they were about to do. Whether this is a designed system or the brain constructing meaning from coincidence is exactly the kind of question that Fallout's world rewards sitting with. The world is full of things that are more than they seem. The Fallout games have spent nearly 30 years making that true in a specific, contained, explorable space. The work isn't done. It keeps going as long as there are players with patience and curiosity, and the willingness to stop moving long enough to see what's already there. End of script. Total script for Q Plays Fallout Easter eggs. Only 1% of players know sleep video. Extended reflections. How the lore hides inside the world. There is a thing the Fallout games do that no amount of coverage or analysis ever quite captures, and it's the thing that makes the Easter eggs feel different from the Easter eggs in other franchises. In most games, an Easter egg is a puncture in the fourth wall, a moment where the game stops being itself and acknowledges that it's a game, that there are people who made it, that those people had opinions and preferences and cultural references that don't belong to the fictional world. These moments can be charming, but they ask the player to step out of the fiction for a moment to appreciate them. The Fallout Easter eggs mostly don't do this. The Jaws reference near Oberlin Station is fully integrated into the game world. The skeletons are simply there, in the world, as though that arrangement happened for reasons internal to that world's history. The player who recognizes the reference experiences it as something the game world itself is doing, not as a wink from the developers. The fiction and the reference coexist without the fiction collapsing. This is a more difficult achievement than it might seem, and it's one of the reasons these secrets feel so satisfying to find. They don't break the world to make their point. They make their point while keeping the world intact. This quality is also why the franchise has produced such a large body of community speculation and interpretation, not just what is this Easter egg referencing, but what does this Easter egg mean within the world it's part of. The mysterious stranger discussions in the Fallout community are not about whether the developers were making a reference to noir fiction. They're about who the mysterious stranger actually is within the fiction, how he moves through the game's timeline, what his existence implies about the moral structure of the wasteland. The Easter egg has been absorbed into the lore. It has become part of the mythology rather than a comment on it. The radio signals are the fullest expression of this quality. The number station broadcasting from Tower LP8907 in Fallout 3 is a reference to real-world number stations. But within the game's fiction, it's also simply a radio signal broadcasting from the ruins of the pre-war world, a piece of infrastructure that has outlasted its context and its purpose, still running because nothing has stopped it, still transmitting because transmission is what it was made to do. The reference and the world building are the same thing. You can engage with the number station as an Easter egg referencing Cold War signals intelligence, or as a piece of environmental storytelling about a world that's still broadcasting the remnants of a civilization into empty air, or as both. The game supports all of these readings simultaneously. The Lonesome Road DLC is perhaps the most extreme case of this integration in the entire franchise. The DLC itself is structured as an engagement with the question of what the courier's past means, what the choices they made before the game began have cost, what the road they walked has done to the places and people it passed through. Ulysses' accusations and the courier's confrontation with them work as character drama and as philosophical arguments simultaneously. The Easter egg quality of the DLC, the way it references other Fallout games, the way it connects to events in the earlier DLCs, the way it situates the courier within a larger history is inseparable from its storytelling quality. The references are the meaning. The history is the drama. This is what the best version of the Fallout games achieves. A world where the Easter eggs are the world, where the references are the texture of the place, where paying attention at every level produces a coherent experience that is richer for the attention rather than disrupted by it. The developers who made this possible over nearly 30 years did so by caring about the integration as much as they cared about the content, by asking not just, what should we hide here, but how should this thing we're hiding become part of where it's hidden? The secrets in these games are, in the end, an argument about the kind of player the franchise was made for. Not the player who follows the quest markers and moves on. Not the player who optimizes their character build and ignores the world around them. The player who reads, who looks, who follows the signal, who asks what the skeleton is saying and why the radio is still playing, and who left this painting in this bar, and what was sitting in the back corner of this vault before the bombs fell, and everything changed. That player is the one who is always supposed to find this. These secrets were built for them. And somewhere in the wasteland right now, in a corner that most people have passed by without stopping, there is still something waiting to be found. The franchise has been here for almost 30 years, and it is still keeping its best secrets. That is not an accident. That is a design philosophy. That is a love letter written to the most attentive members of the audience, in the language of the world itself, hidden in plain sight in every corner of a ruined America. Read the terminals. Follow the signals. Look at the skeletons. Listen to the radio. The wasteland is still talking to anyone patient enough to hear it. Extended section. The terminal entries nobody read. There is a specific experience shared by a small percentage of Fallout players, one that never gets discussed in coverage of the games because it's not dramatic enough to make for good headlines, but that players who've had it tend to describe as some of their most memorable time with the franchise. It happens when you sit down at a terminal in an empty office building, or a sealed room in an intact vault, or the administrative section of a factory that was running fine when the bombs fell, and you read everything on it. Not just the important entries, not just the ones flagged by quest markers or that unlock doors you need to open. Everything. The admin notes, the HR complaints, the inter-office memos about parking allocation and the broken coffee machine and the person who keeps leaving the conference room a mess. The mundane human texture of a workplace that existed before the world ended. These entries are in the games in enormous quantity. They're not referenced by any quest. They don't give experience points. Nobody tracks whether you've read them or ignores you if you haven't. They're in the game because someone sat down and wrote them, treating the task of filling in the texture of a fictional civilization with the same care that a novelist brings to period detail, trying to make the background world feel like it was inhabited by actual people who had actual lives, that were not primarily about the things the main story is about. In Fallout 3, the terminal entries at Robco Industries, the company that manufactured the Pip-Boy and various other technologies that appear throughout the franchise, document an internal corporate culture in the months and years before the Great War. The entries include productivity reports, personnel files, product development notes, and the specific kind of corporate communication that has its own distinct linguistic register: bureaucratic, careful, optimized for deniability while maintaining the appearance of accountability. Reading through the full archive of Robco entries is a project that takes time and produces a remarkably specific picture of what it was like to work at a major technology corporation in the Fallout universe's version of the late 21st century. Most players never spend that time. The picture is there for whoever does. The Vault-Tec Corporation terminals are even more extensive and even more carefully constructed. The terminals at Vault-Tec headquarters in the Capital Wasteland and in the various Vault-Tec administrative facilities scattered throughout the franchise's different game worlds document the company's internal culture from multiple perspectives. The executives who understood the full scope of what the vaults were designed to do, the middle management who implemented the programs without necessarily knowing why, the rank-and-file employees who thought they were working for a legitimate emergency preparedness corporation, the moral horror of Vault-Tec's project, the deliberate design of human experimentation programs, the selection of experimental populations from communities who volunteered for shelter without knowing what shelter meant, is built into the terminal entries in layers that correspond to different levels of insider knowledge. The terminals at Corvega Assembly Plant in Fallout 4 document the last months of a working car factory in pre-war Boston, a place where people came to work every day to make vehicles that other people would drive in a world that had more in common with the 1950s than with contemporary automotive manufacturing. The entries document labor relations, production targets, equipment maintenance issues, the social dynamics of a large industrial workplace. Reading them before engaging with the plant's current population of raiders and fusion core depleted machinery produces a specific quality of melancholy. You know the specific names of some of the people who used to work here, and you know the kinds of things they were thinking about in the weeks before the end of the world. The listening to the specific radio station entries, not the main stations that everyone hears, but the ones broadcast from specific locations, sometimes produces similar material. In one of the Capital Wasteland's quieter corners, there's a transmission from a ham radio operator who set up his own independent broadcast to communicate with anyone who might be listening in the weeks after the bombs fell. The transmissions he left are a document of someone trying to maintain connection in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, trying to find out if there was anyone else out there, trying to keep the concept of communication alive when the infrastructure that communication depended on had been destroyed. The transmissions are dated. They continue for a period of time, then stop. The stopping is the end of the document. In Fallout, New Vegas, the terminal entries at Camp McCarran, the NCR military base, occupying the ruins of Las Vegas's pre-war airport, include material from both the pre-war period and from the NCR's occupation of the facility. The pre-war airport terminals document what it was like to run a major transportation hub in the final years of the Fallout universe's history. The logistics, the personnel management, the relationship between the airport's role as civilian infrastructure and the increasing militarization of the society around it as resources grew scarce and the political situation deteriorated. The NCR terminals document a military occupation of that same space, with all the ways in which civilian infrastructure repurposed for military use retains the ghost of its original function. Reading both sets of entries in the same location, in sequence, is a kind of compressed history that most players of New Vegas never have. The free-side entries from the various abandoned businesses and residences in the overcrowded, dangerous neighborhood that surrounds the Strip document the experiences of people who came to Las Vegas after the war, attracted by the promise of stability and economic opportunity that Mr. House's operation represented, and who found themselves on the outside of that opportunity when it materialized. These entries have a different quality from the pre-war terminal entries that appear throughout the franchise, because they're from people who were already in the post-apocalyptic world, who had expectations about what that world could offer, and who found those expectations complicated by the reality. The free-side terminals are about the failure of a specific promise to a specific population, and they're tucked into the walls of buildings that most players treat as backdrop for the main quest's movement through the area. One of the most complete examples of this kind of embedded history in the entire franchise is the Terminal Archive at Big MT in Old World Blues. The think tank scientists who have transferred their brains into floating tanks and spent 2 centuries running experiments in their sealed facility are accessible in conversation throughout the DLC, and they provide their own perspective on what happened to them and what they've been doing since. But their terminals, the ones scattered throughout the research complex, documenting the full scope of the experiments that happened in Big MT before and after the war, tell a different story from the one the scientists tell in conversation. The scientists have, as the DLC acknowledges, certain gaps in their memory and certain limitations in their self-awareness. The terminal entries show what was actually happening, as documented at the time, in the voices of researchers who were not yet the distorted things they've become. The gap between the self-presentation of the scientists and the historical record in their own terminals is one of the more subtle forms of unreliable narrative in any game in the franchise. These are all Easter eggs of a sort content that rewards extended engagement with what the game has made available beyond the minimum necessary to complete its quests. They're hidden not in corners of the map, but in the depth of the content itself, in the willingness to go further with material that the game presents as optional. The developers who wrote them knew they would be read by a small percentage of the audience. They wrote them anyway, with care, with specificity, with the kind of detail that makes fictional worlds feel inhabited rather than constructed. The terminal entries that nobody read are the secret layer of the Fallout games that sits beneath all the other secret layers. The film references and developer tributes and wild wasteland encounters are the kind of secrets that get written up and discussed and shared in community spaces. The terminal entries are the kind of secrets that you find alone, at 2 in the morning, in an empty office in a vault that the main quest has already moved past, and that you think about for a long time afterward without necessarily having words for what made them worth the time. That's the deepest Easter egg in the Fallout franchise. The whole world is a message from people who cared enough to write it. You just have to be willing to read. One more thing. The holotapes that weren't part of any quest. Holotapes are Fallout's primary vehicle for personal narrative, the cassette-like devices that characters recorded themselves onto, that preserve voices and thoughts and confessions and jokes and last wills and everything else that people felt worth preserving in the years before and after the bombs. They're scattered throughout the game worlds in enormous quantity, and most players develop a habit of picking them up and listening to them while moving between locations, treating them as background audio for travel. This is a reasonable way to engage with them, and it produces a decent experience of the world's storytelling. But there are holotapes in the Fallout games that are specifically designed to be listened to in one sitting, in a specific place, with attention. These are the ones that function as complete short stories rather than as lore delivery. They have characters, and those characters have arcs, and the arcs have conclusions, not resolutions necessarily, because the post-apocalypse rarely provides those, but conclusions in the sense of arriving somewhere different from where they started. In Fallout 3, a series of holotapes in the DC ruins documents the story of a pair of survivors who found each other after the bombs fell and tried to build a life in the wreckage. The tapes span years. You can find them in order or out of order in different parts of the capital wasteland, and the experience of assembling the sequence yourself, of piecing together a relationship history from recordings that were left scattered rather than preserved, is itself part of the story the holotapes are telling. The relationship the tapes document ends, eventually, in the way that most things end in Fallout, badly, in the face of a world that doesn't provide conditions for things to go well. But the ending is arrived at through a full arc, with specificity, with the accumulation of small moments that make the larger moment land. These are holotapes that reward being treated as literature rather than as collectibles. Fallout, New Vegas has a category of holotape that documents the immediate aftermath of specific battles and conflicts in the Mojave. The recordings left by soldiers and civilians who were in specific places at specific moments when things shifted dramatically. The first Battle of Hoover Dam tapes, which can be found in various NCR and Legion locations, collectively document that event from multiple perspectives in a way that no single character's account could achieve. The veteran ranger who survived it, and the Legion centurion who was there, and the NCR medic who was treating the wounded in the aftermath all recorded what they experienced, and the full account emerges from their combined and sometimes contradictory testimonies. In Fallout 4, the holotapes recovered from the Commonwealth's pre-war domestic spaces are the most concentrated repository of the game's emotional content that doesn't involve any named character. Families recorded themselves. People recorded messages to people they expected to see again. People recorded messages they intended to preserve. And then the bombs fell, and the messages outlasted the people who made them and the people who were meant to receive them. Playing these tapes in the physical spaces where they were recorded standing in the house where a family argument was captured, or in the basement where someone made a recording, they thought they'd be able to play for the person it was intended for, produces an experience that the franchise's main quest cannot replicate. It's grief for people who never existed, which sounds like a contradiction in terms but is what the best fiction consistently achieves. Fallout 76's holotape collection is particularly extensive, reflecting the fact that Fallout 76's structure, a world without NPCs in its original release state, populated entirely by environmental storytelling and player interaction, required the holotapes to carry more of the narrative weight than in previous entries. The responders' logs, the Free States recordings, the Enclave communications, the histories of the factions and communities that existed in Appalachia before the player character awakens and begins their journey, these are all holotape archives of considerable size, and the full picture of Appalachian post-war history that emerges from reading all of them is significantly richer than the version available to players who only pick up what the main quests direct them toward. One holotape in Fallout 76 deserves specific mention: the recording that documents the final days of the Vault Overseer whose journey the player is following. The Overseer's logs are distributed throughout Appalachia, and following them in sequence is essentially a parallel narrative running alongside the player's own exploration. The character who emerges from these logs, the specific person who left them, what she was trying to achieve, what it cost her, what she managed to accomplish before the conditions of the world made further effort impossible, is one of the most complete character portraits in the franchise, built entirely from recordings rather than from any interactive relationship. Players who find all of her logs, in order, in the locations they were left, have a relationship to Appalachia and to the events that preceded the player's arrival that fundamentally changes what the main quest means. Players who find them out of order, or who never seek out the ones in difficult locations, have a different experience of the same story. This is what the holotapes, at their best, do. They create a version of the game's world that is specifically shaped by how attentively you've engaged with the material available to you. The wasteland that someone who has found and listened to every holotape inhabits is not the same wasteland as the one someone who has skipped past the optional audio content inhabits. They're playing the same game, in the same world, and their experiences are genuinely different in ways that matter to how the game's fiction lands. That is a more complete form of hidden content than any Easter egg referencing a film or hiding a developer's name in a poster. The whole game is the Easter egg. The reward for finding it is the experience of playing in a world that's been fully inhabited, that has the depth and texture that comes from being built by people who cared about every corner of it, even the corners most players would never reach. The holotapes are waiting. The terminal entries are waiting. The radio signals are still transmitting. The skeletons are in their specific positions. The painting of Todd Howard as Napoleon is still hanging in the dugout inn. Deacon is watching from Sanctuary Hills. All of it is still there.